Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I grew up hiking the Smokies with my older brother, and by the time I turned 28, we'd covered enough ground to know the difference between getting lost and being in danger. We weren't experts. Not the kind who summit peaks in winter or bushwhack through unmapped hollows, but we weren't weekend tourists either. We knew how fast the light drops under a hardwood canopy in late October, when the leaves are down but the branches still hold enough density to choke the dusk into something thick and early. We knew how sound carries strange along water, how a voice can skip across a creek bend and land behind you when the speaker stands ahead. We'd done Cades Cove enough times to predict where the traffic bunches at the one-way loop, where the deer cross at dawn, and which pull-offs fill first with photographers chasing fog. It was mid-November, and we'd rented a cabin outside Townsend for a long weekend. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a porch that creaked, a wood stove we didn't need because the nights hadn't turned bitter yet. We were both trying to unplug after a year that had ground us down in different ways. My brother had gone through a divorce that left him thin and quiet. I'd been stuck in a job that made my chest tight every Sunday night, the kind of tight that made me reach for my inhaler more than I should. We needed to remember what it felt like to move through a day without checking our phones every 5 minutes, without the little dopamine punch of notifications pulling our attention into 100 fractured pieces. So we left them behind. Mine sat on the nightstand at the cabin, face down, plugged into the wall. His went into the glove box of his truck, powered off, sealed away like we were making a pact. We packed light, 2 headlamps with fresh batteries, a small first aid kit with gauze and tape and ibuprofen, a liter of water each, extra layers in case the temperature dropped, trail mix in Ziploc bags, and my rescue inhaler tucked into the very top pocket of my day pack where I could grab it fast if my lungs decided to tighten up on me. My brother clipped a whistle to his chest strap, one of those orange plastic ones that sounds like a referee's call, and I remember thinking it was overkill, the kind of thing cautious parents pack for kids. But he'd been wearing it on every hike since our dad passed, and I didn't say anything. We left the cabin around 9:30 in the morning. The fog that had settled thick along the pasture overnight had started to thin, pulling back in slow strips that left the grass wet and silver. The air was cool but not cold, still enough that you could hear individual birds instead of the blended chorus you get in spring. The parking area at the trailhead was half full. A few sedans, a muddy Subaru with Tennessee plates, a white van with rental stickers. We geared up without talking much, checking straps and zippers in the automatic way people do when the routine is muscle memory. The plan was simple. Abrams Falls. 5 miles round trip. Mostly flat. Following Abrams Creek through hardwoods and past limestone bluffs. We'd done it twice before. Once in summer, when the falls were just a trickle. Once in early spring, when the water was high and loud. It felt familiar. It felt safe. Safe is a tricky word. The first stretch of trail was wide and forgiving. The kind of path that lets you walk side by side and talk without watching your feet every second. Crushed limestone underfoot, smooth enough for running shoes. Bordered by cedar and mixed hardwoods that smelled clean and sharp in the cool air. The bluff lines stacked up on our right, pale rock layered like old paper, and Abrams Creek ran steady on our left, clear enough in the shallows to see the pale rocks on the bottom and the dark shapes of trout holding in the deeper pockets. We swapped small talk stuff about a family thing I'd been dodging, a cousin's wedding I didn't want to attend, the kind of low-stakes conversation that fills space without requiring much energy. My brother kept a pace that let us breathe through our noses, and I matched it, falling into the rhythm that makes long miles feel shorter. About 40 minutes in, we stopped to drink water on a flat section where the creek widened into a shallow pool. The sun had climbed high enough to cut through the canopy in bright, narrow shafts, and the temperature had ticked up just enough to make me unzip my jacket. My brother knelt by the water to splash his face, and I stepped over to a damp slab of rock near the bank to tighten the laces on my left boot. That's when I saw it. A boot print. Right foot, pressed clean into a thin layer of silt on the flat stone. The kind of print that happens when someone steps down firm and the ground is just wet enough to hold the details. The lug pattern was crisp, deep on the outer edge where the weight had rolled, lighter on the arch. I'm not good at guessing sizes, but it looked like an 11, maybe a 12. The tread was wide and angular, The kind you see on mid-range hiking boots from outdoor chains. Nothing unusual about that. Plenty of people hike this trail. But 10 yards farther along the same type of rock, I found it again. Same lug pattern, same depth, same outer edge pressure that suggested the wearer rolled their foot slightly when they walked. But this time, it was a mirror image. Not a left boot, not a scuffed half print or a heel drag. The exact same right boot, perfectly flipped, pressed into the stone in reverse. I crouched down and looked close, tracing the grooves with my eyes, trying to make sense of it. My brain offered explanations. Maybe someone hopped on one foot, maybe the print doubled back from moisture seeping under the rock, but none of them landed right. The spacing was wrong, the angle was wrong. I called my brother over. He knelt beside me, hands on his knees, and stared at it for a long 10 seconds without saying anything. Then he stood up, brushed his palms on his pants, and said "weird," in a voice that meant he didn't want to make it bigger than it was. I wanted to agree, to let it go, to keep walking and forget about it. But it sat in my head like a nail you step on and decide didn't break the skin. The kind of small wrong thing that itches at the back of your mind even when you're trying to ignore it. We kept going. The trail curved away from the creek and climbed gently into a side hollow that opened up enough to let sunlight pool in the center. The ground was covered in a thick mat of wet leaves, oak and hickory, brown and slick, the kind that muffles footsteps and makes you feel like you're walking on something soft and unstable. In the middle of the clearing, someone had done something deliberate. A pile of wet leaves had been pressed down into an oval, maybe 2 feet long, smooth on top like hands had shaped it. Across the surface, 2 parallel grooves had been dragged through the leaves, thin and even, spaced about 4 inches apart like the tines of a garden tool. Next to the oval, 4 thin sticks had been laid in a row, evenly spaced, and then the pattern just stopped. No continuation, no message, no design that suggested art or intention beyond the act itself. It looked like someone had pressed something into the ground, held it there, and then taken it away. My brother circled it once, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the grooves. I watched the tree line, scanning for movement, for any sign that someone was nearby watching us look at their work. The hollow felt too quiet, not peaceful, empty. The kind of quiet that happens when animals stop moving because something else is there. "Let's go," my brother said, and his voice had dropped into the register he uses when he doesn't want to debate. We stepped back onto the main trail and kept moving upstream. We'd been walking maybe another 20 minutes when he stepped out. Not from the trail ahead or behind, from a cedar thicket on our right, maybe 30 feet off the path. Just standing there, like he'd been waiting for us to notice him. He wore a canvas jacket with the hood pulled up, even though the day had warmed enough that I'd tied mine around my waist. The cuffs were damp and dark, and his gray hiking pants were clean at the knees. No dirt, no mud, no sign that he'd been kneeling or sitting or doing anything that would leave a mark. That's the kind of detail you notice when your brain is hunting for something normal to grab onto, something that explains why your stomach just dropped. He nodded past us, back toward the meadows near the trailhead, and said, "You see the herd?" His voice was pleasant, conversational, the kind of tone you use with strangers at a scenic overlook when you're making small talk about wildlife. But his teeth, when he smiled, they were too square, too even, and they didn't quite meet when his mouth closed. Not a gap, exactly. More like his jaw stopped a touch early, like the alignment was just slightly off in a way that made my eyes want to look away and then look back to confirm what I'd seen. My brother answered with the voice he uses for chatty people at trailheads, the friendly but dun tone that signals we're not stopping to talk. "Yeah, earlier," he said, and gave a polite chin lift. Then he pointed us down the main trail without breaking stride, a clear signal that we were moving on. The man didn't argue. He didn't ask follow-up questions. He just watched us go, his head turning slowly to track our movement, and then he stepped onto the trail behind us. His footsteps were wrong from the start. Not loud, not quiet either. They came in clusters, 3 or 4 steps grouped together and then nothing. Then another cluster, then silence again. It wasn't the rhythm of someone walking at a steady pace. It was the rhythm of someone moving in bursts, stopping to listen, moving again. I turned my shoulders twice to look back, using the narrow width of the trail as an excuse to shift my body and glance behind me. Both times he was farther back than his footsteps had sounded. 20 yards, maybe 30. But each time I faced forward again and kept walking, The sound of his steps closed the distance in ways that didn't match the math of speed and space. My brother noticed too. I could tell by the way his shoulders tightened and his pace picked up just slightly, not enough to look like running, but enough to put more ground between us and the man behind us. We kept Abrams Creek on our left and headed upstream. The trail narrowed, pressed between the water and a steep rise of rock and roots on the right. To check behind me now, I had to stop completely and turn my whole body, and every time I did, he was there, closer than he'd been the last time I looked, but somehow still in the wrong place for how his footsteps sounded. It was like watching someone walk in a video where the audio is delayed, where the sound of their shoes hitting the ground doesn't sync up with the movement of their legs. My brother knelt to fix a bootlace that didn't need fixing. I knew what he was doing, creating a reason to stop, to see what the man would do, to force a reaction we could read. The man closed the distance until he was standing about 15 feet back, close enough that you'd speak instead of call out. And then he looked at me and said, in the same pleasant conversational voice, "Do you still keep your inhaler in the top of your pack?" The world tilted. Not metaphorically, literally. Like the ground had shifted under my feet and I had to lock my knees to stay upright. I do keep my inhaler in the top pocket of my pack. I always have. It's the first thing I check when I'm packing for a hike. The muscle memory of unzipping the pocket and feeling for the familiar plastic shape. But I hadn't used it today. I hadn't mentioned it. I hadn't pulled it out to check it or show it to anyone. And I'd never met this man before in my life. My hand moved by reflex to the zipper, fingertips brushing the pull tab, confirming it was still there, still closed, still holding the thing I might need if my lungs decided to seize up. My brother stood fast enough that it wasn't casual, and put his palm flat on my shoulder, pushing me a half step behind him. His voice stayed calm, but it had lost the friendly edge. "We're turning back." The man tipped his head toward the right, toward the rock wall where no trail existed. "I'll show you a better loop," he said. We both looked. There was one trail. It was the one we were standing on. No spur, no side cut, no faint trace of a footpath winding up into the woods. We looked forward again. He was ahead of us, not walking past, not running ahead while we were distracted, just standing there 12 paces up the trail, already positioned at a narrow pinch point where the bluff pressed close to the water and there was no way to pass without brushing shoulders. I don't know how he got there. Neither of us saw him move. I said one word to my brother. Low and clear, quiet enough that the man couldn't hear it, but loud enough that there'd be no pretending I'd said something else. Skinwalker. I don't know why that word came out. We're not superstitious people. We didn't grow up with stories about shapeshifters or tricksters or spirits that wear skin like clothes. But something in my brain reached for the wrongest, oldest word it could find. The kind of word that carries weight even when you don't fully believe in it. And that's what came out. My brother's face went pale. Not in the slow way that happens when someone feels sick fast, like all the blood had been pulled out of his face at once. He didn't tell me I was being ridiculous. He didn't laugh or ask what I meant. He just tapped the whistle clipped to his chest strap with one knuckle, a quick check to confirm it was still there, and then nodded once. We didn't run. Running would have burned us out in 100 yards, left us gasping and stumbling and vulnerable. We didn't try to act tough, didn't puff up or raise our voices or do anything that would turn this into a confrontation. We did the only thing that felt like ours, the only strategy we could control. Pick open ground, force anything that wanted to get close to do it where we could see it coming. The creek bed was open stone for long stretches, slick in places, uneven but honest. You could see 50 yards in either direction, and nothing could approach without being visible. We cut over to it, stepping down carefully from the trail into the water. The cold hit at my ankles first, then soaked into my socks and rose above my arches. It was sharp and clean and real, and it kept me from overthinking, kept my body focused on balance and movement instead of spiraling into panic. My brother lifted the whistle to his mouth and blew 3 sharp blasts. The sound cut through the hollow, loud and bright and unmistakably human, a signal that we were here and we weren't hiding. The man flinched, but not right away. A full beat after the sound died. His head snapped to the side and his shoulders twitched, like he'd learned what a flinch was supposed to look like, and missed his cue by a second. It wasn't instinct. It was performance, delayed and wrong. We kept moving upstream, stepping carefully over submerged stones, using our hands for balance when the current pushed against our calves. The water was loud here, masking smaller sounds, and that made me more nervous, not less. I wanted to hear everything. I wanted to know where he was at every second. But he kept appearing. He'd cut straight through thick cedar and step out ahead of us, already facing the direction we were moving, not the direction he'd come from, like he'd skipped the pivot entirely. He'd crouch low to pass under brush he could have stepped over, and then stretch tall beneath branches that didn't require it, like he was adjusting his height to fit spaces that weren't there. If you've ever watched someone rehearse blocking for a play, changing their posture to hit marks on a stage, it looked like that, except there were no marks. There was no stage. There was just him, moving wrong, appearing wrong, existing wrong. We developed 3 rules without discussing them. Sightlines first. Make sound before any blind turn. Keep moving. We stopped talking except for short, necessary words. Step, left, stop, now. On a flat slab in the middle of the creek. The silt showed 2 parallel grooves. Thin and shallow, spaced about 4 inches apart. The same spacing as the marks in the leaf pile. No tracks around them. No explanation for how they got there. My brother glanced at me. I saw his jaw tighten. He didn't stop. Neither did I. The trouble came at a shallow cascade where the water dropped in 2 short shelves over pale limestone. The exit was pinched hard against the bank, narrow enough that only one person could climb through at a time, and if you wanted to intercept someone there, it was the perfect spot. I took the first step up, planting my boot on a slick, angled rock, and my foot slid out from under me. Not a dramatic fall, just a stupid, clumsy loss of traction that sent my knee slamming into the stone. The pain was immediate and dull and watery, the kind that makes your eyes tear up and your breath catch in your throat. I didn't scream. I just froze for a second, blinking hard, trying to force my body to keep moving when all it wanted to do was curl up and assess the damage. The man was 3 long steps away on the bank, hands loose at his sides, chin lifted like he'd found the right height for whatever he was trying to be. His hood had fallen back, and I could see his face fully now. Ordinary features, forgettable, except for the teeth that didn't meet right, and the way his eyes didn't blink at the normal intervals. My brother didn't yell. He didn't waste time with words. He grabbed the stainless steel water bottle clipped to his pack strap, yanked it free, and threw it hard at the rock just to the man's right. The bottle hit with a sharp metallic ring that bounced off the bluff and came back at us in a flat, dissonant echo. The man's head snapped toward the sound. But not when it happened. After the ring had already died. After the echo had faded. His hands opened in a delayed, learned reflex. Fingers spreading wide like he'd practiced the motion but hadn't practiced the timing. It was enough. My brother grabbed the top strap of my pack and hauled me up, shoving me across the lip of the cascade with enough force that I stumbled forward and caught myself on my palms. We scrambled into the open section beyond, moving fast, ungraceful, driven by something older than logic. We didn't sprint. Sprinting dies in 100 yards, leaves you bent over and gasping and helpless. We picked a steady pace that made my teeth click together with each step, that burned in my thighs and made my knee throb in rhythm with my pulse. Every time we lost sight of the trail behind us for a second around a bend, behind a fallen tree, my brother hit 3 blasts on the whistle. Every time I watched for that late jerk in the man's movements, that wrong beat that told me he wasn't moving the way things move when they're real. It came again and again, over and over. The same delayed reaction to sound. The same incorrect flinch that arrived a fraction of a second too late. It followed us like a drumline that had learned the song off sheet music but never heard it played, never felt the rhythm in their bones. I started counting the seconds between whistle blasts and flinches. 1 Mississippi, sometimes 2, never 0. My brother noticed too. I saw him turn his head slightly each time he blew the whistle, watching for the reaction, timing it, filing it away in the part of his brain that catalogs threats and patterns. The man kept appearing ahead of us, cutting through spaces we couldn't see him cross, standing in places he shouldn't have been able to reach. But he never touched us, never closed the final distance. It was like he was herding us, guiding us along the creek, keeping us moving in a direction he wanted, and all we could do was refuse to stop, refuse to let him pin us against water or stone. My lungs started to burn. Not from exertion, from fear. The kind of breathlessness that comes when your body forgets how to pull in air because your nervous system has dumped everything it has into your bloodstream and your chest feels like it's wrapped in steel bands. I reached for my inhaler, fingers fumbling with the zipper, pulling it free, pressing it to my mouth and taking 2 sharp puffs without breaking stride. The metallic taste of the medicine coated my tongue, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting to 4 on the inhale, holding 4 on the exhale. My brother glanced back at me, saw the inhaler in my hand, and his expression went hard. He knew, he understood what it meant that the man had asked about it, had known where it was, had used that information like a hook to catch my attention. We rounded a final bend, and the trail widened. The parking lot appeared through the trees, a rectangle of gravel scattered with vehicles, pale sedans and muddy SUVs, a green Ranger truck parked near the trailhead kiosk. A uniformed ranger stood beside the truck with a clipboard, writing something down, her pen moving in steady lines across the paper. We must have looked bad. My knee was bleeding through my pants, a dark wet patch spreading across the fabric. My face was probably pale, streaked with sweat and creek water. My brother's jaw was locked tight enough that I could see the muscle jumping under his skin. The ranger's head came up fast when she saw us stumble out of the tree line. She set her clipboard on the hood of the truck and took 2 steps toward us, her hand moving instinctively to her radio. My brother didn't waste time. He said, "Someone's following us," in the tone he reserves for emergencies where information wins seconds. Knows things he shouldn't. Asking personal questions. The ranger keyed her radio without looking away from the trail mouth. Already scanning the trees for movement, she gave a compact professional description. Male, hooded canvas jacket, gray pants, odd behavior, approaching hikers, potential threat, and then asked our names and what happened. We told her about the inhaler. We told her about the mirrored boot prints. We told her about the grooves in the leaf pile, the wrong timing of the flinches, the way he kept appearing ahead of us without crossing the ground in between. Her pen paused mid-stroke at that, hovering over the paper for a long second, and then kept moving. She wrote everything down without comment, without skepticism, just clean documentation of what we reported. Another ranger arrived within 5 minutes. A younger man with a radio on his chest and a serious expression. He jogged the trail at an even, controlled pace, hand resting on the strap of his own whistle, and disappeared into the trees. The first ranger positioned herself so she could see the first 50 yards of the trail without letting us drift out of her line of sight. We stood by the truck, breathing hard, not talking, just waiting for the second ranger to come back with something. An explanation, a person, anything solid and real. He was gone longer than I liked and shorter than I feared. Maybe 15 minutes. He came back breathing evenly, no one with him, and said to the first ranger in a low voice meant for her, but loud enough that we heard. Heard talking off trail. Didn't sound like conversation. Words spaced wrong. Not arguing, not calling. Short pieces, each one given a slot, like someone practicing lines too far apart. The first ranger nodded once, and wrote that down too. We drove straight to the sheriff's substation in a small town about 20 minutes from the trailhead. The deputy at the front desk had a lined face and steady voice, the kind of person who doesn't rush or dismiss or make you feel small for reporting something strange. He took the report the way you want a report taken. Time, place, details, our names, our contact information. He put a small dot on a wall map pinned behind the desk, right near the area where we'd been hiking, and then asked 2 more questions that told me he'd read other dots, that this wasn't the first time someone had come in with a story that didn't quite make sense. He didn't try to sell us an explanation, didn't say it was a lost hiker or a mentally ill person or someone playing a prank. He said during rut season, we get calls where somebody hears the elk and then hears something trying to match. People too. Could be a person. Could be more than one. Could be someone not well. You did the right things. Open ground. Noise. Keep moving. That was it. No dramatic revelation. No promise of an investigation. Just documentation and acknowledgement that we'd done what we could. We drove back to the cabin in silence, watching the roadside, checking mirrors more than we needed to. We changed small things after that. I moved my inhaler to my jacket pocket and bought a second one for the glove box. I signed up for a self-defense class at a community center near my apartment, and kept going until I could do the basic moves without thinking, palm strikes, elbow jabs, how to break a wrist grip. My brother added rubberized grip sleeves to our water bottles so they'd be easier to throw. And he bought a second whistle for his truck, the kind that comes on a breakaway lanyard. We still hike. We go early. We stay on marked trails. We don't go back to that side hollow. If you're asking yourself what it was, stop. That's the wrong question. Pick safer ones. Ask what you'll do when someone is behind you and knows a detail they shouldn't. Ask how you'll buy a second when your knee hits rock. Ask how you'll move when the only track is narrow and the person who is behind you is somehow ahead, already facing the way you're going. Out there in that season, some things try to copy. Elk do it during rut, bugling back and forth in voices that crack and soar. People do it, mimicking animal sounds, practicing calls. And sometimes you meet something that is good at copying posture, and worse at copying time. Something that learned what reactions look like but not when they happen. So if you go hiking in November, and someone with squared teeth that don't quite meet asks if you saw the herd, and then falls in behind you with footsteps that cluster and fade, don't bother with lectures, don't trade questions, don't try to logic your way through it. Get to open ground, use sound, keep moving until the trees thin, and you see vehicles and people with radios who won't laugh at you for doing the boring things that work. That's how you get back to your car. That's how you drive to the nearest station and put a dot on a map and tell it once so somebody else hears it. That's how we got out. And that's the only part that matters. I'm not posting this for thrills. I'm posting it because I learned the rules the hard way, and I don't want you learning them the same way. If you take the unpaved road out along the rim at Angel Peak Scenic Area off US 550 near Bloomfield, New Mexico, and you plan to stay past dark, bring another vehicle and park nose out. My spouse and I didn't break any laws or mess with anything. We thought we were being smart, careful even. We were wrong about what careful meant out there. We picked a bluff top pullout in late October of 2022 because the air was cool and the sky out there looks clean enough to drink. I mess with landscape shots on weekends, but this wasn't a big trip. We'd been married 3 years by then, both of us 31. Both of us thinking we knew how to handle backcountry camping, cheap lantern, enamel pot, paperbacks. Our old 4Runner knows that road. It's got a ladder rack on the back that rattles when you climb it, the kind of rattle you learn to ignore after a few trips. 2 sites over. A family in a red pickup built a quick camp. Father looked about 45, mother maybe a year or 2 younger. 2 kids in their teens who moved with that efficient silence you only get from families who camp together regularly. No music, no noise, no generators up and down the rim. Just the wind coming in off the Badlands and the smell of sage so strong it made my sinuses clear. We set up before sunset. The shelters out there are simple roofs with a table under them, open to the view, the kind of setup that feels safe because you can see everything coming from every direction. Angel Peaks sat across a maze of white and gray ridges like a flat-topped island. The light went orange first, painting the rock formations in shades that don't exist anywhere else I've been. Then it shifted to purple, then to that particular shade of deep blue that lasts maybe 5 minutes before true darkness hits. I remember thinking the whole scene looked like something from a coffee table book too perfect to be real. The kind of landscape that makes you understand why people used to think certain places were sacred. I was stirring ramen when movement on the rim path caught my eye. At first I thought jogger, which didn't make sense out there, but people train on weird surfaces all the time. Ultra runners do stranger things than jog along exposed bluffs at dusk. Only this wasn't a normal run. The figure moved low, torso level, arms quiet against the sides, gliding more than stepping. No headlamp or reflective anything. No sound of footfalls on gravel or the ragged breathing you always hear from someone pushing themselves at altitude. It traced the edge of the bluff in a lazy arc and stayed there. Just far enough that I couldn't make out details. Just a shape that was always in motion. The distance was maybe 200 yards. That middle ground where you can tell something is human-sized but can't pick out features. I kept glancing up and losing it behind rock outcroppings, and then catching it again farther along the rim, always maintaining the same strange fluidity. The ground out there breaks into dips and small shelves, loose scree patches that shift under your boots if you're not careful. Spots where the edge crumbles if you get too close. The shape never changed pace for any of it. It went up a small roll in the ground without any check in rhythm, without that forward lean you always see when someone climbs, and slid down the far side like it was on rails. My spouse joked that maybe the person was training for altitude races, and I shrugged, but I kept watching. The thing about watching something that bothers you is that your brain tries to normalize it. You tell yourself stories. Maybe they're a local who knows every inch of that trail. Maybe they grew up running these paths and can do it blindfolded. Maybe they're wearing dark clothes and that's why they blend so well with the rock. Your mind does these small acts of kindness to keep the fear pushed down where it can't bother you too much. But some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years as a wildland firefighter before I took the desk job, knew the movement was wrong. When you work in the back country long enough, you learn to read how things move. Animals have their own rhythm. Humans have theirs. This thing had neither. It had the purposeful quality of something hunting, combined with the endless patience of something that doesn't get tired. The family 2 sites over got quiet. I noticed it because they'd been talking in low, comfortable tones while they set up their camp. The kind of family conversation that's more about presence than content. Now they were still. Their father stood by the truck bed, hands resting on the side rail, facing away from the view and toward the same line of rim where I'd last seen the shape. His shoulders were rigid in a way that suggested he wasn't just stretching his back after a long drive. Dark took over between one breath and the next. That's how it happens in the desert. One moment you have enough light to see details, the next you're squinting at shapes. We turned the lantern down to stretch the fuel. No point in burning through it when we had the whole night ahead. Stars came on hard. That desert sky that makes you understand how people used to navigate by them, how they used to tell stories about them. I didn't want to fixate on the ridge path, so I did camp chores, stowed the bowls, shook out the tarp, tied a loose line that had come undone from the shelter post. The wind moved in uneven pushes, not steady enough to predict, just present enough to mask other sounds. Behind me, small pebbles ticked down the slope. The sound was distinct, rhythmic almost, like someone dropping gravel one piece at a time. I turned with the lantern, and the sound cut off instantly. The beam showed nothing but gray rock and scrub brush. I set the lantern down on the picnic table, and it started again from farther left, a soft cascade of tiny impacts. After a minute it came from the right, then behind the shelter post where the light didn't quite reach. It wasn't constant, just a quiet spaced pattern that drew a circle around us, moving counterclockwise around our campsite. Small rocks don't roll uphill, and the slope didn't run all one way. Some spots tilted toward the bluff edge, some toward the parking area, some ran level. For the sounds to move in a circle like that, something would have to be causing them. I told myself it was animals. There are plenty out there. Ringtails, foxes, coyotes, even the occasional bobcat if you're unlucky. But it felt patterned, like something testing how close it could get without being seen. Like something mapping our position in the dark, learning the layout of our camp through sound and movement. My hands started to sweat despite the dropping temperature. I wiped them on my jeans and went around to the back of the 4Runner to put the pot away. To do something normal and practical that would remind my nervous system that we were just camping, just doing what we'd done a dozen times before in a dozen other places. The dust on the bumper near the ladder rack showed a mark I hadn't seen earlier. You know how you can press your hand into dust and it leaves the shape for a while? It looked like that, but wrong. The palm was long and narrow, twisted a little to the side, like it had been jammed down to get grip on the metal. What got me were the knuckle spots. There were more than there should have been, spaced in a way my brain tried to turn into normal and couldn't. I touched it with one fingertip and a little drift of powder fell off the bumper. The mark underneath was smeared where my finger had been, but the rest remained clear. 4 knuckles where there should have been 3. The thumb impression too far to the side. The whole thing elongated in a way that suggested whoever made it had bones that bent differently than mine. My heart started doing that thing where it feels like it's beating in your throat. That physical response you can't talk yourself out of no matter how many rational explanations you try to stack up. Maybe someone from another campsite had leaned on our truck while walking by. Maybe it was an old mark I'd never noticed. Maybe the dust had settled in some weird pattern that coincidentally looked like a distorted handprint. None of those explanations felt true. "Hey," my spouse said, low from the shelter. Their voice had that particular quality that meant they were trying to stay calm while something bothered them. "I think they're packing." The family 2 sites over had moved fast without making a show of it. The cooler was already in the bed of the truck. The dome tent that had been up not long before was gone, rolled and strapped with the kind of efficiency that comes from practice. The father stepped out into the common view line like he was just stretching his legs, casual and unhurried in a way that felt deliberate. He looked right at me across the space between our sights, and shaped 2 words with his mouth without sound. Car now. His face in the dim light from their own lantern showed no panic, just absolute certainty. I didn't make a speech. I didn't ask my spouse what they thought, or suggest we tough it out, or convince myself we were being paranoid. Something about the father's face, about the way he'd mouthed those words, flipped a switch in my head. I just said, "We're going to head out," and we started moving like we'd trained for it. Lantern down to a low setting, chairs folded without bothering to wipe them down, sleeping bags thrown into the back with no folding, stove tossed into the storage bin without parts sorted or cleaned. I kept the light pointed low, not scanning for anything, just keeping the ground honest so we wouldn't trip and hurt ourselves in the rush. Down the slope, a dry scrape moved across stone and stopped. It sounded like someone dragging a stick across rough granite, except there was a weight to it, a deliberate quality that sticks don't have. The ladder rack let out a thin metallic note as the wind hit it from a different angle, or maybe it was something else. I didn't turn around to check. When we shut the rear hatch, my hands were shaking enough that I had to try twice to get it latched properly. The family's truck was already idling, that low diesel rumble you can feel through the ground. No headlights yet. They were turned toward the road and waiting, giving us space to pull out first since we were parked closer to the exit track. We pulled out first because we were closer to the track. I kept the beams on their lowest setting until the road dropped away from the rim, partly to preserve our night vision and partly because some instinct told me that calling attention to ourselves with bright lights would be a mistake. The surface was the kind that turns into washboard if you drive it when it's damp, and then it dries with ridges baked in, a corrugated mess that makes your fillings hurt. The steering wheel hummed in my hands, harmless and familiar, just the normal vibration of rough road travel. A quarter mile in, the road dips through a shallow saddle before climbing toward the entrance. Standard geology for the area, nothing remarkable about it. As the Forerunner nosed over that dip, the back end sagged hard, like 2 people had stepped onto the rear ladder at once. I've hauled plenty of gear, loaded that rack with kayaks and bikes and camping equipment until the suspension groaned. I know what weight feels like. This was sudden and substantial, enough to make the front tires lighten on the gravel. The steering went floaty, that dangerous feeling when the front end doesn't want to track straight anymore because too much weight has shifted rearward. The tires chattered on gravel in a way I know well from loading too much weight in the back, that rapid skipping sensation that means you're close to losing traction. The metal in the rack gave off a groan I hadn't heard from it before, a deeper note that suggested real stress on the welds. "What was that?" my spouse said, not loud, not panicked. Just enough to confirm it wasn't my imagination, that they'd felt it too, that the laws of physics had just told us something was now on our vehicle that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. I didn't want to stab the brakes and pitch the weight forward. Didn't want to find out what would happen if whatever was back there got thrown off balance and toward us. I feathered them gently, feeling for traction, feeling for control. Whatever was on the rack shifted. You can feel that through the whole vehicle when you've done enough dumb camping loads over the years. You get the slide first. That lateral movement as weight redistributes. Then the frame flex, the entire body of the vehicle twisting slightly. Then the slight yaw, the rear end wanting to swap places with the front. I felt all 3 in sequence, each one distinct, each one confirming that something heavy was moving around back there like it was trying to find better purchase. Then a heavy drop hit the gravel behind us. It wasn't a rock. Rocks bounce and scatter and make multiple sounds as they come apart or roll. This was a one-piece landing followed by a second, lighter thump, like something landing on 2 feet instead of 4. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw dust hanging low in our taillights, illuminated red and dense. Something long dragged along the passenger side rear quarter panel as it regained balance. The sound was clean and thin, like a screwdriver line across paint, deliberate and controlled. Not the chaotic scraping of something falling off a moving vehicle. This was intentional, the sound of something steadying itself, using my truck's body as a handhold while it found its footing on the road. The family's truck behind us tapped its brakes twice, quick flashes of red, and gave us a little more space. Enough that if we needed to stop suddenly, we wouldn't get pushed. Enough to tell me they'd seen something too, that this wasn't mass hysteria or shared delusion. They were experienced enough to know that if something went wrong up ahead, they needed room to react. I kept the speed steady and the wheel straight, fighting every instinct that told me to floor it, to get as far from this place as fast as possible. Panic kills people on backcountry roads. Rollovers kill people. Losing control in the dark on washboard gravel kills people. Whatever was happening, I needed to stay controlled. The shock passed. The weight was gone. The suspension settled back to normal. But the rack rattled more than before. A new sound mixed in with the familiar one, like something had been bent or loosened. We came to the entrance sign, that big brown National Forest marker that looked beautiful in the starlight, and took the fork toward US 550 without looking anywhere but the road ahead. I didn't check the mirrors. I didn't scan the roadside. I just drove, focusing on the immediate practical reality of keeping the vehicle on the road, of not clipping a rock or dropping a wheel off the edge. We hit the highway in a pair. Hazards on for the first few minutes like we were a funeral procession. The adrenaline ebbed in steps. First when we saw another set of headlights coming from the south, a semi or RV that represented normal people doing normal things on a normal night. Then more when the first town lights showed up ahead. That orange glow on the horizon that meant electricity and gas stations and other human beings who had no idea what kind of night we'd just had. We pulled into the big bright lot by the gas station near where US 550 and US 64 meet in Bloomfield. The place was loud with regular life in a way that felt almost aggressive after the silence of the rim. Teens laughing by a car, working on something under the hood. The chime from the convenience store door opening and closing. The smell of fryer oil floating across the pumps, mixing with diesel and gasoline. That didn't make me feel safer exactly, but it put distance between us and the rim, created a buffer of normalcy. The father from the other campsite walked to the back of his truck and angled the tail light housing under the overhead lights. The red plastic had 4 gouges carved into it, deep enough that you could wedge a coin. The spacing was wrong for human fingers. They curved inward, not down, like whatever made them had wanted to grip the light fixture itself, not just scrape past it. The plastic was scored white in the deepest parts where it had been compressed before it tore. He didn't make a scene. He looked at me like this was business, like this was information being transferred from someone who knew to someone who didn't, and said the only sentence I've repeated word for word since that night. Folks call it a skinwalker. Don't camp up there solo after Halloween. We checked our own rig. The scratch started under the lower rung of the ladder rack, tracked forward across the quarter panel, and ended at the fuel door. It wasn't jagged like a branch would make. It looked planned, a single movement, straight and confident, not the flailing of something slipping or the random damage from road debris. The paint had a pale curl at the edge where whatever made the line had lifted tiny shavings as it went. I set my fingernail in it and felt it catch, felt the depth of it, felt how it had gone through the clear coat and into the color layer beneath. That kind of scratch doesn't come from anything light or accidental. It takes force. It takes intention. We didn't fill up. We didn't talk with the family about back roads or trails or who was from where or what we'd all just experienced. There was an understanding that talking about it wouldn't help, that trying to make sense of it would just make it harder to drive away. They got in and pulled out, tail lights still bright but scored, heading north while we headed south. We booked a cheap room in Farmington, with a bed that felt like a board, and a TV that buzzed with some electrical issue. I kept thinking about the weight on the rack, and the way the suspension had communicated the truth of it. The honest sag that happens when something climbs where you didn't invite it. The physics of it. The realness of it. I didn't suggest going back in daylight to look for tracks. I didn't trace the scratch for an hour like someone obsessed. We slept badly, both of us waking at sounds that turned out to be ice machines or people walking past our door. We left early, before the free breakfast, before the sun was fully up, driving straight through back to Albuquerque where we lived. Back home, I bought a small bottle of rubbing compound and a foam pad and worked the quarter panel in the shade of the carport. Most of it blended after an hour of careful work. One thin mark stayed. Under certain angles, you can't see it at all. Under others, it shows as a hairline under the clear coat, like a faint healed cut on skin that never quite disappears. We kept the 4Runner. We kept camping. We didn't go back to that rim. 2 weeks later, I pulled the rear hatch trim to quiet a new rattle in the rack. The top bolts were shiny like they'd been rubbed with fine grit, but only on the faces that would get contact if something slid forward and then off. That wasn't from any gear we carry. We strap everything tight, use proper tie-downs, check them twice. You can say it was old damage that I never noticed. You weren't the one who cleaned those bolts last spring with a wire brush and locked them down with blue thread compound. If you need a lesson out of this, take mine. That rim feels safe because it's close to a highway, and because the sites look like regular picnic spots. They are not a regular place after the last of October. If you go anyway, don't stay alone and don't get cute with your lights or your bravado. Park so your nose points out. Pack before the sky goes black. If you start hearing small rocks roll in separate places around you and it sounds like nothing when you look, stop treating it like a joke. The family who warned us didn't owe us anything. They still hung back and watched us out to the entrance sign, making sure we made it to pavement. People will tell you the story is missing proof. That's fine. Proof isn't what made me change my habits. The scratch on the quarter panel taught me more than 100 pictures could. The way the back end dropped taught me enough for 3 trips worth of lessons. The gouges in that tail light were wrong in a way that doesn't leave your head once you've seen it. Maybe it was a person trying hard to look like something else. Maybe it was a trick of angles and wind and nerves. Believe whatever lets you sleep. Just don't stay up there alone after Halloween. And if you do go, despite everything I've told you, make sure your vehicle is pointing toward the exit before dark. Make sure you can leave fast. Make sure you're not giving something the chance to decide whether you leave at all. I still have the 4Runner. I still take it camping, but I don't take unpaved roads near reservation land in late October anymore. I don't dismiss strange sounds as wind, and I check my bumper for marks I can't explain. That's what the rim taught me. That's what those few hours cost. God help anyone who learns it harder than I did. I became a park ranger after my nervous breakdown, thinking nature would heal me. But nature has its own kinds of madness. The transfer to the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota was supposed to be my salvation. 6 months ago, I'd been Detective Sarah Chen, working homicide in Minneapolis until the Ramirez case broke me. A family of 4, tortured and mutilated in ways that still visited my dreams. The killer was never found. After 3 weeks of barely sleeping and seeing shadows that weren't there, my captain suggested a leave of absence. I suggested something more permanent. The Forest Service welcomed me with open arms. They needed someone with investigative experience, they said. Missing persons cases were becoming more frequent in the remote sections of the forest, and local law enforcement was stretched thin. What they didn't tell me was that the missing weren't just hikers who'd lost their way. My first week was blissfully quiet. I patrolled the northern sectors, checked campsites, issued a few citations for improper food storage. The silence felt like medicine after years of sirens and screaming. But on my 8th day, I got the call that would remind me that monsters exist everywhere, even in paradise. "We've got another one missing," crackled the voice of Ranger Jorge Martinez over the radio. Hiker named Caleb Morrison, age 23. His girlfriend reported him overdue from a solo camping trip in the Boundary Waters. Last seen 3 days ago at the Isabella Lake trailhead. I grabbed my gear and drove the 40 minutes to Isabel Lake, where Jorge was waiting with Morrison's girlfriend, a pale young woman named Amy who kept wrapping and unwrapping her hands around a coffee cup. He was only supposed to be gone 2 days, she said for the 3rd time since I'd arrived. Caleb's experienced. He's been hiking these woods since he was a kid. He knows them better than anyone. Jorge shot me a meaningful look. This was the part they hadn't mentioned in my orientation. In the past 18 months, 7 people had gone missing in the northern sections of the forest. 3 had eventually been found dead, their bodies discovered weeks later in states that the official reports described as consistent with animal predation. The other 4 had simply vanished, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. We found Morrison's campsite easily enough. His tent was still standing, sleeping bag laid out, camp stove sitting cold with a half-prepared meal of beans and rice still in the pot. No signs of struggle, no indication of what might have prompted him to abandon his gear and walk into the wilderness. But there were tracks. Not Morrison's boots. We'd found those prints leading away from the camp in a straight line toward the deeper forest. These were different. Larger. Much larger. The impressions were nearly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with what looked like toe marks pressed deep into the soft earth near the lakeshore. "Bear?" I suggested, though I knew better. I'd seen bear tracks. These were humanoid, bipedal, with a stride length that suggested something walking upright on legs far longer than any human's. Jorge knelt beside the prince, his weathered face grim. Maybe, though I've never seen a bear track quite like this. He looked up at me, and I caught something in his expression. Fear, maybe, or recognition. There's something you should know about this area. The Ojibwe have stories about these woods. Old stories. As we followed Morrison's trail deeper into the forest, Jorge told me about the Wendigo. In Ojibwe legend, it was a creature born of cannibalism and starvation. A giant with yellowed fangs, sunken eyes, and an eternal hunger for human flesh. The stories described it as once human, transformed by its own terrible appetite into something that could never be satisfied. My grandmother was Ojibwe, Jorge said, as we pushed through a stand of birch trees. She used to tell me that the Wendigo could smell desperation from miles away. It hunted those who were lost, both literally and spiritually. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, but the tracks we were following told a different story. Morrison's boot prints continued in an unnaturally straight line, never deviating, never pausing, as if he'd been walking in a trance. And parallel to them, always just to the left, were those massive, impossible footprints. We followed the trail for 3 miles before we lost it in a rocky section near a creek. The last clear print we found was Morrison's, at the edge of a steep ravine. Beyond that, nothing. Could he have fallen? I asked, peering down into the dark crevice below. Jorge shook his head. Look at the spacing of his prints. He wasn't stumbling or running. He was walking deliberately, like he knew exactly where he was going. We rappelled down into the ravine, but found no sign of Morrison at the bottom, just more of those enormous tracks, leading north toward the most remote section of the forest. That night I lay awake in my cabin, staring at the photographs I'd taken of the prints. In my previous life, I would have run them through databases, looked for matches, built a profile of the person who'd made them, but these weren't human. The proportions were wrong, the size impossible, the toe marks suggested something with long clawed digits, and the depth of the impressions indicated a creature of enormous weight and size. I thought about calling this in to the FBI, to someone who might have resources I didn't, but what would I tell them? That I thought a legendary monster was stalking hikers in the Minnesota wilderness. That would be a quick way back to mandatory therapy and early retirement. The next morning brought news of another disappearance. Antonio Vasquez, a wildlife photographer from Duluth, had been reported missing by his editor when he failed to return from an assignment photographing moose in the Northern Territories. His rental car was found parked at a trail access point just 10 miles from where we'd lost Morrison's trail. This time, I went alone. Vasquez's equipment was scattered near his car. Expensive camera lenses, tripods and film canisters strewn across the ground as if dropped in haste. But again, no signs of struggle. And again, those same massive tracks, this time leading away from the parking area toward a section of forest so remote it didn't even appear on some maps. I followed the trail for most of the day, documenting everything, taking photographs, trying to maintain some semblance of professional procedure even as my understanding of reality continued to crumble. The tracks led me through increasingly dense forest, past fallen logs and streams, always heading north. As the sun began to set, I heard something that stopped me cold. A voice, calling from somewhere ahead in the darkness between the trees. "Help me," it said, weak and desperate. "Please, someone help me." I drew my service weapon, a habit from my police days, and called out. "This is Park Ranger Chen. Where are you?" "Here," came the voice, closer now. "I'm hurt. I can't walk." I moved toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the gathering dusk. But something felt wrong. The voice was coming from different directions now, as if the speaker was moving, circling me. "Keep talking," I called. "I'm coming to you." "Help me," the voice said again. And this time I realized what had been bothering me. It was the same phrase, repeated exactly, with the same inflection, the same tone, like a recording being played back. I stopped walking. The forest around me was completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no insect buzz. Just that terrible expectant quiet that settles over a place where something unnatural is about to happen. "Help me," the voice said again, and now it was directly behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the trees, and saw it. The thing standing 30 feet away wasn't entirely unlike what I'd expected. based on Jorge's description of the Wendigo. It was massive, perhaps 9 feet tall, with long, disproportionate limbs and fingers that ended in yellowed claws. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched taut over a skeletal frame that suggested starvation despite its size. But it was the face that nearly made me scream. It was wearing Antonio Vasquez's face. Not like a mask, but as if it had somehow absorbed his features, twisted them into something wrong. The eyes were sunken pits, the mouth too wide, filled with teeth that belonged to no human. "Help me," it said in Vasquez's voice, and I saw that its mouth wasn't moving in sync with the words. I raised my weapon, though I doubted bullets would do much good against something that shouldn't exist. But before I could fire, it was gone, melting back into the shadows between the trees with impossible speed. I ran. I'm not proud of that, but I ran through the forest in the dark, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots until I reached my vehicle. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. Back at the ranger station, I found Jorge waiting for me with 3 other rangers I'd never met before. Jessie Kim, a quiet woman in her 30s who worked the eastern sectors. Carter Williams, a veteran ranger with 20 years in the service, and Cash Rodriguez, barely out of college but with eyes that suggested he'd seen things that had aged him prematurely. "We need to talk," Jorge said. They took me to a back room I'd never been in before, where a large map of the forest covered one wall. Red pins marked locations throughout the northern sections, dozens of them, far more than the official missing persons reports I'd been told about. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Officially? 18 months, Carter said. "Unofficially? There have been stories about this area for generations. The missing persons reports just started getting documented more carefully in the past few years." Jessie pulled out a thick folder full of photographs, witness statements, and incident reports. "We've been tracking it, trying to understand its patterns. The thing you saw tonight, we call it the mimic. It seems to absorb something from its victims, some essence that lets it wear their voices, their faces. It's getting bolder," Cash added. "The disappearances used to be spread out over months. Now it's taking someone every few days." I looked at the photographs in Jessie's folder. Footprint casts, blurry trail camera footage, and witness sketches that all showed variations of the same impossible creature. "Why haven't you reported this? Why isn't the FBI involved? Or wildlife services, or—" "We tried," Jorge interrupted. 2 years ago, when Ranger Remy Thompson first started documenting encounters, the official response was that we were dealing with a large bear, possibly suffering from some kind of disease that was making it more aggressive. When Remy pushed back, insisted on a full investigation, he was quietly transferred to a desk job in Bismarck. Carter pointed to several pins on the map. "It has a territory, roughly 100 square miles in the most remote part of the forest. It doesn't seem to hunt outside that area, but anyone who enters—" He shrugged grimly. "We think it keeps them," Jessie said quietly. "The ones who disappear. There's a place deep in its territory where we think it takes them. We've never been able to get close enough to confirm, but—" She trailed off, pulling out a final photograph. This one was grainy, taken with a telephoto lens from a great distance. It showed a clearing in the forest where the trees formed an almost perfect circle. In the center were structures, not buildings, exactly, but constructions of branches and bones, and what might have been fabric. And scattered around these structures were shapes that looked disturbingly like human figures. "We think some of them are still alive," Cash said. "Trapped there, maybe being kept as—" The next morning, 2 more people went missing. Zane Foster and Omar Williams, college students from the University of Minnesota who'd been backpacking in the area, failed to check in with their families as planned. Their car was found at yet another trailhead, this one even closer to what the Rangers had identified as the creature's core territory. "That's it," I said, studying the map. "We're not waiting for permission or backup. If there's a chance those kids are still alive, we have to try." Jorge looked skeptical. "Sarah, this thing has been hunting these woods for generations. It knows every tree, every stream, every hiding place. 5 rangers with hunting rifles aren't going to—" "6 rangers," interrupted a voice from the doorway. We turned to see Emerson Gray, the district supervisor, standing in the entrance to the room. He was a man in his 50s with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work. but his eyes held an intelligence that suggested he'd been following our investigation more closely than we'd realized. "Sir," Jorge said carefully. Emerson stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "I've been a ranger for 28 years. I know what's out there. I also know that if we don't stop it soon, it's going to start expanding its hunting range. There are scout camps and tourist lodges less than 50 miles from its current territory." He pulled out a detailed topographical map and spread it on the table. "The clearing Jesse photographed is here, in a section of forest that's been completely off limits to the public for the past year. We've been telling people it's due to environmental restoration work, but really it's because we've lost 2 survey teams in that area." "You want us to go in there?" Cash asked, his voice tight with fear. "I want us to end this," Emerson replied. "I've been in contact with some people, specialists who deal with situations like this. They're flying in from Colorado tonight with equipment designed for large predator control." Jesse frowned. "What kind of specialists?" Emerson's smile was grim, the kind that don't officially exist. The specialists turned out to be a 3-person team that arrived in an unmarked black SUV just after midnight. They called themselves hunters, and they carried equipment I'd never seen before, rifles that looked more like science fiction props, ammunition that glowed faintly blue, and detection devices that they claimed could track cryptobiological entities by their electromagnetic signatures. The team leader was a woman named Dr. Sarah Voss, a former Army Rangers officer who now worked for what she described only as a private organization dedicated to managing anomalous wildlife situations. Her teammates, Marcus and David, were equally tight-lipped about their backgrounds, but their equipment and tactics suggested military training combined with something that went far beyond conventional wildlife management. "The entity you're dealing with is what we classify as a Type 4 cryptid," Dr. Voss explained as she assembled her rifle in the ranger station's main room. "Highly intelligent, adaptive, and possessed of abilities that place it outside normal biological parameters. The mimicry you've observed is just one of its capabilities. It also demonstrates enhanced strength, speed, and what appears to be a form of psychic influence over its prey." "Psychic influence?" I asked. Marcus, a thin man with pale eyes, looked up from his equipment. "The way your missing persons walked directly into its territory, showing no signs of fear or resistance, that's not normal human behavior. This thing can project some kind of mental compulsion, draw victims to it like a spider luring flies. The good news," David added, checking the sights on his rifle, "is that we've dealt with similar entities before. They can be killed, but it requires specific tactics and specialized ammunition." Dr. Voss spread out her own map of the forest, one that showed far more detail than ours. "We'll approach the central territory from 3 directions, creating a triangular containment pattern. The goal is to locate the missing persons and extract them while simultaneously driving the entity toward a predetermined kill zone." "What if the people we're trying to rescue are already dead?" Jorge asked. "Then we make sure this thing doesn't claim any more victims," Dr. Voss replied coldly. We set out before dawn, moving through the forest in carefully coordinated teams. Jorge and I formed one unit, approaching from the southeast. Cash and Jesse came from the southwest, while Emerson paired with Dr. Voss's team to approach from the north, directly toward the clearing where the creature was believed to keep its prisoners. The forest felt different as we moved deeper into the creature's territory. The normal sounds of wildlife gradually faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The trees grew more dense, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the morning sunlight. Even the air felt different, thicker, with a smell like rotting leaves and old meat. "Movement ahead," Jorge whispered, pointing through the trees. I saw it too, a dark shape moving between the trunks about 50 yards ahead of us. It was roughly human-sized but moved with an odd, stuttering gait that suggested injury. "Survivor?" I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew better. We approached carefully, weapons ready, until we were close enough to see clearly. It was Caleb Morrison, or what had been Caleb Morrison. He was walking in a slow circle around the base of a large oak tree, his movements mechanical and repetitive. His clothes were torn and filthy, his skin pale and waxy, but it was his eyes that confirmed my worst fears. They were completely white, rolled back in his head, and his mouth hung open as if he were screaming, though no sound came out. "Jesus," Jorge breathed. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Unit 2. We found Morrison. He's..." Dr. Voss's voice crackled back. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. The entity may be using him as a lure. As if summoned by her words, Morrison suddenly stopped walking and turned directly toward us. His white eyes seemed to focus despite their condition, and when he opened his mouth, Antonio Vasquez's voice came out. "Help me," he said in that same desperate tone I'd heard 2 nights ago. "Please, someone help me." Then Morrison collapsed, his body hitting the ground like a discarded puppet. "It's close," Jorge said, raising his rifle. "It's watching us." The attack came from above. The creature dropped from the canopy like a spider, landing between Jorge and me with enough force to shake the ground. Up close in daylight, it was even more horrifying than I'd imagined. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at impossible angles, and its skin had a translucent quality that showed the dark network of veins beneath. But it was wearing a new face now, Zane Foster's face, twisted into an expression of predatory hunger. Jorge fired first, his bullet catching the creature in the shoulder and spinning it around. It screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and I saw that its mouth was filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. I emptied my clip into its center mass, watching the bullets tear through its chest without seeming to slow it down. It backhanded Jorge, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening crack, then turned toward me with Foster's face wearing an expression of terrible amusement. "Help me," it said in Morrison's voice, then lunged. I dove aside, rolling behind a fallen log as the creature's claws raked the air where I'd been standing. From somewhere in the distance, I heard more gunfire. The specialist's weapons, recognizable by their deeper, more resonant reports. The creature pursuing me suddenly stopped and cocked its head, listening. Then, with that impossible speed I'd witnessed before, it bounded away through the trees toward the sound of the battle. I crawled over to Jorge, who was conscious but bleeding from a head wound. "Can you move?" "I think so," he groaned. "Where did it go?" "Toward the others. We need to." My radio crackled to life. "All units converge on the central clearing immediately," Dr. Voss's voice commanded. "We have multiple targets and at least 6 civilians still alive." We helped each other through the forest, following the sound of sustained gunfire toward what I hoped would be the end of this nightmare. But as we stumbled through the dense undergrowth, I could hear other sounds beneath the shooting voices calling for help, screaming, and something else that might have been laughter. The clearing, when we finally reached it, was a scene from hell. The structures Jesse had photographed were revealed to be crude shelters built from branches, bones, and what I now recognized as clothing and personal effects from dozens of victims. In and around these shelters, the missing persons were scattered like broken dolls, some moving, some still, all bearing the same blank-eyed expression I'd seen on Morrison. But they weren't the creature's prisoners. They were its extensions. As Dr. Voss's team fought the main entity in the center of the clearing, the missing persons began to converge on them, moving with that same mechanical coordination. Zane Foster and Omar Williams shambled toward David, who was reloading his rifle. Antonio Vasquez and 3 other victims I didn't recognize surrounded Marcus, reaching for him with fingers that had grown long and clawed. "They're not human anymore," Dr. Voss shouted over the chaos. "The entity converts them, makes them part of itself." The main creature, the original Wendigo, stood in the center of the clearing, and I finally understood what we were really facing. It wasn't just a monster that ate people. It was something that consumed their essence, their identity, and incorporated them into itself. The faces it wore weren't masks. They were the faces of its victims, absorbed and twisted into extensions of its will. But Dr. Voss's team hadn't come unprepared. Their specialized ammunition was having an effect that normal bullets couldn't achieve. Each hit caused the creature to lose cohesion, its borrowed faces flickering and changing as if it were struggling to maintain them. "The neural disruptors are working," Marcus called out as he fought off the converted victims. "But we need a clean headshot to sever the connection." Dr. Voss raised her rifle, sighting carefully despite the chaos around her. But before she could fire, Emerson appeared from the tree line, running directly toward the creature with what looked like a grenade in his hand. "Emerson!" "No," I shouted, but he was already pulling the pin. The explosion wasn't like any grenade I'd ever seen. Instead of shrapnel and fire, it produced a brilliant white light that seemed to burn away the shadows in the clearing. The creature screamed, not with one voice but with dozens, the combined agony of all its victims crying out at once. When the light faded, the Wendigo was on the ground. its form flickering between the various faces it had worn. But it wasn't dead. If anything, it looked more solid now, more real, as if the explosion had forced it to choose a single identity. It chose mine. I watched in horror as my own face materialized on the creature's head, my own voice coming from its mouth as it struggled to its feet. I became a park ranger after my nervous breakdown, it said in my voice, thinking nature would heal me, but nature has its own kinds of madness. Dr. Voss's rifle boomed, the specialized round taking the creature through what had been my forehead. This time it went down and stayed down, its body dissolving into something that looked like shadow and smoke. Around the clearing, the converted victims collapsed as if their strings had been cut. Some of them, I realized with growing hope, were beginning to stir with something that looked like genuine human awareness. "It's over," Dr. Voss said, lowering her weapon. But her voice carried no triumph, only weary professionalism. "The entity is dead, and the psychic connection has been severed. The survivors will recover, though they may not remember much of their captivity." Jorge limped over to where I was kneeling beside Morrison, who was blinking in confusion but appeared to be genuinely conscious for the first time in days. "What happens now?" Jorge asked. Dr. Voss was already packing up her equipment. "Now you write reports about a rogue bear that was terrorizing campers until park rangers were forced to put it down. The survivors were found suffering from exposure and dehydration after being lost in the woods. End of story." "And the truth?" She looked at me with eyes that had seen too many impossible things. "The truth is that there are monsters in this world, and sometimes people like us have to deal with them so that people like you can go on believing the world makes sense." As the medical evacuation helicopters arrived to transport the survivors, I found myself staring into the forest that had become my sanctuary and my nightmare. I'd come here seeking healing from one kind of madness, only to discover another that ran far deeper than human corruption. But perhaps that was the lesson I'd needed to learn. The monsters we face aren't always the ones we expect. Sometimes they're ancient things that have been waiting in the dark corners of the world, feeding on our fears and weaknesses. And sometimes, the only way to defeat them is to accept that we're all capable of becoming monsters ourselves, and choose not to. 6 months later, I'm still a ranger in the Superior National Forest. The missing persons reports have stopped and the Northern Territories are once again safe for hikers and campers. But I carry Dr. Voss's card in my wallet, and I know that if I ever encounter something that goes beyond normal Park Service procedures, there are people I can call. Because I've learned that nature doesn't just have its own kinds of madness, it has its own kinds of hope as well. In the face of something that should have destroyed us all, we found the courage to fight back, to protect the innocent, and to ensure that the darkness didn't spread. That's got to count for something, even if no one else will ever know. My name's Elijah Cade, and in 1999 I worked for the Department of Homeland Security investigating missing persons cases near the Canadian border, just outside a little-known town called Fort Kent, Maine. Fort Kent's one of those places where folks leave their doors unlocked and wave to passing cars, assuming everyone's friendly. The kind of town where the local diner serves coffee so strong it could wake the dead, and everyone knows everyone else's business before they know it themselves. But that all changed after reports started piling up of people who had just stopped being there. No traces, no clues, just gone. The files on my desk had grown thick with testimonies that read like ghost stories. A family of 3 from Boston, last seen buying supplies at the general store. A solo hiker from Vermont, her backpack found empty by the trailhead. All her gear mysteriously returned to perfect order as if she'd never packed it. An elderly couple celebrating their 40th anniversary. Their rental car discovered with the engine still running, doors wide open, dinner still warm in takeout containers on the dashboard. I'd been in the game long enough to know when something wasn't adding up. People don't just walk off into the wilderness and erase themselves from the map. It's always messier than that. Footprints, torn fabric, blood, something. Bodies leave evidence, even when people don't want them to. In my 15 years with the department, I'd seen everything from elaborate staging meant to look like disappearances to actual abductions that left crime scenes that told stories in their own brutal language. But not in Fort Kent. Here it was as if the land itself swallowed them whole, digesting every trace of their existence until nothing remained but paperwork and grief. I arrived in town around noon. My government sedan looking absurdly official against the backdrop of pickup trucks and rusted sedans. The atmosphere was already thick with the kind of silence that made my skin prickle. Not the comfortable quiet of rural life, but something heavier, more oppressive. It reminded me of the silence that falls over a forest just before a storm, when even the insects seem to hold their breath. The few people I passed on the street averted their eyes, hurrying along with the practiced urgency of those who'd learned not to linger in open spaces. The town itself seemed smaller than it should have been, as if buildings had been quietly disappearing along with the people. Empty lots stood where storefronts should have been, marked only by concrete foundations that crumbled at the edges like broken teeth. Even the main street felt hollow, with more for sale and closed signs than actual businesses. The lucky few establishments still operating had their windows covered with newspaper or cardboard, creating an eerie uniformity that made the whole place feel like a movie set dressed for abandonment. I checked in with the local sheriff, a man named Hayes who looked like he'd been carved out of the woods himself. Tall, wiry, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much. His office reeked of stale coffee and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. The walls were covered with missing person flyers, their faces staring down at me with expressions frozen in happier times. Some of the photos were so faded they looked like they'd been hanging there for years, the paper curling at the edges and spotted with what might have been water damage or something worse. He didn't mince words. "You're not going to find much," Hayes said, leaning against his beat-up cruiser. The vehicle looked like it had been through a war, its paint scratched and dented, one headlight held in place with electrical tape. "We've had 8 people go missing, and there's not a damn trace of any of them. It's like they just walked off the face of the earth." 8. I raised an eyebrow. My last briefing had mentioned 5. The discrepancy sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "When did the count change?" "Yeah, another 3 in the last month," Hayes continued, his voice taking on a hollow quality that made me think he'd repeated these words many times before. "All tourists, campers or loners passing through, people who won't be missed right away. It's almost like the forest picks them off, selecting the ones who won't cause too much fuss when they don't come home." The way he said it, casual and matter of fact, made my blood run cold. This wasn't the voice of a man concerned about his community's safety. This was the voice of someone who'd made peace with something terrible. I kept my voice steady, though his words set my instincts on edge. "Mind if I take a look at the spots where they were last seen?" Hayes nodded, but there was something reluctant in the gesture, as if he was hoping I'd change my mind. "I'll take you up there, but don't expect much. It's like they were never here to begin with. The forest has a way of cleaning up after itself, if you know what I mean." I didn't know what he meant, and that was precisely what worried me. We drove in silence, his cruiser bumping along gravel roads that snake through the dense woods surrounding Fort Kent. The forest seemed to press closer to the road with each mile, ancient pines and gnarled oaks creating a canopy so thick that it turned midday into twilight. I scanned the scenery, taking in the towering pines and thick underbrush, noting how the trees seemed to lean inward over the road as if they were trying to close it off entirely. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The trees themselves seemed diseased, their bark blackened and weeping some kind of dark sap that stained the trunks like dried blood. Many of the branches hung at unnatural angles, as if they'd been deliberately broken and left to heal crooked. The underbrush was too thick, too uniform, creating walls of vegetation that would be impossible to penetrate on foot. It was the kind of place where getting lost seemed not just easy, but inevitable. Even more disturbing was the complete absence of wildlife. In 15 years of investigating cases in rural areas, I'd never been in a forest so utterly devoid of animal sounds. No bird song, no rustling of small mammals, no buzz of insects. Just the steady rumble of the cruiser's engine, and the crunch of gravel under the tires. It was as if every living thing had fled, leaving only the trees to stand witness to whatever happened here. Hayes pulled up near a secluded trailhead, and cut the engine, and the silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. "Last one went missing just off this path," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A couple reported seeing a man out here, looked like he was, I don't know, waiting. But he vanished before anyone could get close, like smoke," they said. "There 1 second, gone the next." We stepped out, and the silence settled back in, thick and oppressive. Even the wind seemed muted here, unable to penetrate the dense canopy above. The air itself felt different, heavier, with an odd metallic taste that made my mouth feel dry. I found myself breathing shallowly, as if the atmosphere might be toxic. I followed Hayes as he led the way, every step feeling like it might be my last normal one. The trail wound deeper into the forest, narrowing as the trees grew closer together. What little sunlight managed to filter through the canopy cast everything in a sickly green glow that made the shadows seem deeper and more substantial than they should have been. Branches caught at my jacket with an almost deliberate persistence, and more than once I had to stop to untangle myself from thorns that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The path itself was wrong too. It was too worn for the amount of foot traffic Fort Kent could possibly generate. Worn down to bare earth that was packed hard as concrete. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks from maintenance vehicles, no signs that anyone had actually walked this way in years. It was as if the path maintained itself, or something else maintained it. Then we came to a small clearing, barely noticeable if you didn't know where to look. The trees formed an almost perfect circle around a patch of ground that was completely barren. No grass, no weeds, no fallen leaves. Just bare earth that looked like it had been swept clean. The air here was even heavier, with an underlying scent of decay that made my stomach turn. Hayes stopped, pointing to the ground with a gesture that seemed almost ritualistic. This is where they last saw him. We scoured every inch of this place, and there's nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just emptiness. His voice had taken on that hollow quality again, and I noticed that he wouldn't step into the clearing itself, remaining carefully on the path. I crouched down, scanning the dirt and underbrush for anything out of place. But he was right. The clearing was unnaturally clean, as if someone or something had deliberately erased all evidence of human presence. The earth itself looked wrong, too uniform in color and texture, like it had been replaced rather than cleaned. Still, something felt wrong beyond the obvious wrongness of the place. My gut told me there was more to this than simple disappearances. I'd learned to trust that feeling over the years. It had saved my life more than once. This place felt hungry, if that made any sense. Like it was waiting for something. I stayed behind after Hayes left, wanting to get a feel for the place alone. He'd been reluctant to leave me, mumbling something about how people shouldn't be in the woods by themselves. But I'd insisted. I needed to experience this place without his nervous energy affecting my judgment. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles deep in your bones and makes you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat. But it wasn't empty quiet. It was expectant quiet, like the moment before a predator pounces. Every few minutes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I'd turn to look, there would be nothing but trees and shadows. Then I heard it, a faint rustling just beyond the clearing. I stood still, listening, straining to make out any sound over my own breathing and the almost inaudible whisper of wind through the upper branches. The rustling grew louder, more distinct, with a rhythm that was almost like footsteps but not quite, too irregular, too dragging. The sound stopped altogether, leaving a silence so complete it made my ears ring. "Hello?" I called out, more out of instinct than expectation. My voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, absorbed by the oppressive atmosphere. There was no answer, but I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows between the trees. Something that looked human in shape but moved wrong, with joints that bent in directions that shouldn't have been possible. It was there for just a moment, then gone, leaving me wondering if I'd seen anything at all. The hours ticked by as I searched the area, finding nothing but that gnawing sense of unease that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. The shadows lengthened and shifted in ways that didn't match the movement of the sun, and more than once I found myself backing away from patches of darkness that seemed too deep, too solid. By the time I made my way back to my car, the sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows over the forest that seemed to reach for me like gnarled fingers. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath came out in visible puffs that hung in the still air longer than they should have. As I walked back along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the path had changed somehow, that branches that had been on my left were now on my right, that clearings I'd passed were no longer there. I drove back to town with my headlights cutting through a darkness that seemed thicker than normal night. In the rearview mirror, the forest looked like a solid wall of black, and I could have sworn I saw pale shapes moving between the trees, keeping pace with my vehicle. Back at the small motel I was holed up in, I reviewed the case files by the light of a flickering desk lamp. The building itself felt wrong. Too many empty rooms, too many hallways that led to nothing. The walls were thin enough that I should have heard other guests, But the silence was complete, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood that sounded almost like footsteps. Each disappearance was eerily similar. Lone hikers, small groups, even an entire family of 3. They'd all vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and belongings that were invariably found arranged with disturbing precision. The strangest part was that none of them had been carrying much, as if they'd intended to return within a few hours, but they never did. The more I read, the more patterns emerged. Every disappearance had occurred during the day, usually between noon and 4 p.m. Every victim had been alone at the moment of vanishing, even if they'd been part of a group. Somehow they'd all wandered off by themselves just before they disappeared, and in every case witnesses reported seeing the person acting strangely in the hours before they vanished, as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. Most disturbing of all were the detailed descriptions of the victims' behavior in those final hours. They'd all become fixated on the forest, staring into the trees with an intensity that made observers uncomfortable. Several witnesses described the missing persons as seeming called or summoned, moving toward the tree line with a purposefulness that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. The family of 3 had been particularly unsettling. The parents had taken their young daughter on what was supposed to be a simple day hike. According to the lone witness who'd encountered them on the trail, all 3 had been walking in perfect single file, moving deeper into the forest with mechanical precision. When called out to, they turned in unison, their faces completely blank, their eyes reflecting light like animals' eyes. They'd stared at the witness for several long seconds before continuing on their way, disappearing around a bend in the trail. The witness had waited for them to return, growing increasingly concerned as hours passed. When he'd finally worked up the courage to follow their path, he'd found it led to a dead end, a sheer rock face with no way through. There was no sign of the family, no indication of where they could have gone. The trail simply ended, as if they'd walked through solid stone. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of empty forests and hollow-eyed figures that moved through the shadows just beyond the edge of vision. I woke several times to the sound of scratching at my window. But when I looked, there was nothing there but darkness and the reflection of my own haunted face. The next morning I returned to the forest, this time with more gear and a determination to get answers. I'd brought a digital camera, several spare batteries, a GPS unit, and enough supplies for a full day of investigation. I'd also made sure someone knew where I was going. I'd left a detailed message with my supervisor back at headquarters, complete with coordinates and a timeline. As I trudged through the underbrush, following a different path this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickling on the back of my neck, but it grew stronger with each step. The sensation was so intense that I found myself stopping every few minutes to scan the trees, looking for any sign of an observer. The forest seemed different in the morning light, but not better. If anything, it was more unsettling. The shadows were sharper, more defined, creating pockets of darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. The silence was even more complete, if such a thing were possible, and the air had that same metallic taste that made my mouth feel dry and unpleasant. Then I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time, and more deliberate. It had a rhythm to it, like something large moving carefully through the underbrush. I whipped around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Just shadows and branches swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. I pressed on, my hand resting on the grip of my sidearm. The weight of the weapon was reassuring, though I had a growing suspicion that conventional tools might not be much use here. Whatever was happening in these woods, it didn't follow normal rules. After another hour of searching along an overgrown path that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A shoe, half buried in the dirt, its laces tangled and frayed. But it wasn't the shoe itself that disturbed me, it was the way it had been placed. The shoe was positioned perfectly upright, as if someone had carefully arranged it as a marker or a sign. The surrounding area had been cleared of debris in a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter. Leaves, twigs, and other forest litter had been swept away so thoroughly that the bare earth beneath was visible, packed down hard and smooth. I knelt down, examining the shoe more closely, and found a faint smear of what looked like dried blood on the sole. But the blood wasn't random. It formed a pattern, almost like symbols or letters, though I couldn't make out what they might mean. The shoe itself was expensive, well made, the kind a serious hiker would wear, but it showed no signs of normal wear, no scuffs or dirt that would indicate it had been worn for any significant distance. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of a struggle or any clue about what had happened to the shoe's owner. The clearing around the shoe was wrong in the same way the other clearing had been wrong. Too clean, too deliberately arranged. It was like a stage set, prepared for some performance I couldn't understand. That's when I heard it. A low, chilling chuckle from somewhere behind me. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to locate its source. I spun around, gun drawn, but there was no one there. Just the trees and the silence, and that sense of being watched by something that found my fear amusing. I stood there, heart hammering, every nerve on edge, the weight of my weapon suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever was out here. The chuckling had stopped, but the presence remained, closer now, more focused, as if my discovery of the shoe had triggered some kind of response. Then, a voice, low and mocking, drifted through the trees. "You're not the first to come looking, and you won't be the last." The voice was close, too close, but I couldn't see where it was coming from. It seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, from the shadows between the trunks, from the very air around me. The words were clear but somehow distorted, as if they were being filtered through something that wasn't quite human. I backed up slowly, keeping my gun raised, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of the speaker. The voice had been male, I thought, but there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. It was too controlled, too deliberate, like someone speaking a language they'd learned but never quite mastered. The forest around me seemed to respond to the voice, the shadows deepening, and the silence becoming even more oppressive. Even the air felt different, thicker, with that metallic taste becoming so strong it made me want to gag. Whatever was out here, it was getting closer. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure slipping through the shadows like smoke, there and gone again before I could focus on it properly. It moved wrong, with a fluid motion that suggested joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. When it stopped, partially visible behind a massive pine, I could make out the rough outline of a man. The figure was tall and lean, with a wild, unkempt appearance that made my skin crawl. Its clothes were torn and stained with dirt, and something darker, something that looked like it might once have been blood, but had dried to a rusty brown. The fabric hung in tatters, as if it had been shredded by thorns or claws, and what skin was visible was pale to the point of being almost translucent. But it was the eyes that truly disturbed me. Even from a distance, even in the dim forest light, I could see that they were wrong. They reflected light like an animal's eyes, glowing with an internal luminescence that had nothing to do with the sun filtering through the canopy. They were fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like prey. "You don't belong here," the figure said, its voice that same distorted rasp that seemed to blend with the wind. The words came from its direction, but they seemed to echo from all around me, as if the forest itself was speaking. None of them did. "Who are you?" I demanded, my gun trained on the center of its mass. My voice sounded thin and weak in the oppressive atmosphere, absorbed by the trees before it could travel more than a few feet. The figure laughed, and the sound was worse than its voice. A hollow, humorless sound that seemed to strip away something essential from the air around me. "Just a caretaker," it said, taking a step closer. When it moved, I could see that its feet didn't quite touch the ground, that it seemed to glide rather than walk, keeping things the way they should be. Before I could react, it lunged forward, moving faster than should have been possible for anything human. Its hand reached for something at its side, and I caught a glimpse of metal, some kind of blade or tool that gleamed with the same unnatural light as its eyes. I fired, the shot echoing through the trees like thunder, but it dodged with impossible speed, disappearing into the shadows like it had been born from them. The gunshot seemed to trigger something in the forest around me. The silence that had been so oppressive suddenly broke, replaced by a rustling, creaking sound that came from every direction at once. It was the sound of many things moving through the underbrush, all converging on my location. I stumbled back, heart racing, realizing too late that the figure had drawn me into a trap. All around me, the shadows moved, shifting and coalescing as more figures emerged from between the trees. Men and women, their faces blank and their eyes hollow as if they'd lost whatever humanity they once had. Their clothes were in the same tattered condition as the first figures, and they all moved with that same wrong, gliding motion. But these weren't quite the same as the first figure. These looked more human, More like people who had once been normal but had been changed by something terrible. Their skin had the same translucent quality, but it was marked with dark veins that showed through like a roadmap of corruption. Their movements were less fluid, more jerky, as if they were marionettes being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. As they emerged from the shadows, I could see that there were far more of them than the 8 missing persons on file. Dozens of figures surrounded me, forming a loose circle that tightened with each passing second. Some wore clothes I recognized from the missing persons reports. A red flannel shirt, a distinctive hiking boot, a baseball cap with a local team logo. Others wore older clothing, styles from decades past, as if they'd been here far longer than the recent disappearances. I backed up, firing at the nearest figure, but my bullets seemed to pass through them without effect. They didn't even flinch, just kept coming with that relentless, silent approach. Their hollow eyes were fixed on me with a kind of hunger that chilled me to the bone. Not the hunger for food, but something deeper and more terrible. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized I was outnumbered, trapped in a forest that seemed to swallow all sound and light. The figures were close enough now that I could see the details of their transformation. The way their fingernails had grown into claw-like appendages. The way their teeth had elongated into sharp points. The way their skin seemed to ripple and shift as if something was moving beneath it. One of them, wearing the remains of a park ranger uniform, opened its mouth and made a sound that was part whisper, part hiss. Others began to echo the sound, creating a chorus of inhuman noise that made my bones ache. The sound seemed to penetrate my skull, making it difficult to think, to focus, to maintain any sense of direction or purpose. I broke into a run, dodging between the figures as they reached for me with those transformed hands. Their fingers brushed against my jacket, and even through the fabric, I could feel an unnatural cold that seemed to seep into my bones. The touch left dark stains on the material, as if their very essence was corrosive. I tore through the forest, dodging branches and roots, my lungs burning from the effort and the strange toxic air. Behind me, the figures followed, their footsteps eerily silent despite their numbers. When I risked a glance back, I saw them moving through the trees like smoke, their forms becoming indistinct and then solidifying again, as if they existed only partially in the physical world. The forest itself seemed to be working against me. Branches appeared out of nowhere to catch at my clothes and skin. Roots rose up to trip me. The path I'd followed into the woods seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving me running blindly through increasingly dense undergrowth. I didn't stop until I'd burst out onto the main road, gasping for breath, my body aching from the desperate sprint. The normal world hit me like a physical blow. The sound of a car engine in the distance, the feel of asphalt under my feet, the clean taste of air that didn't carry that metallic taint. For a moment I almost collapsed from relief. I didn't dare look back as I raced to my car, fumbling for the keys with shaking hands. But as I sped away from the forest, I couldn't resist checking the rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the trees like a line of sentinels, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. Even at a distance, even through the mirror, their gaze felt like ice water in my veins. Back in Fort Kent, I went straight to the sheriff's office, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. The normal world of the small town felt surreal after my encounter in the forest. The warm lights in windows, the sounds of normal human activity, the absence of that oppressive silence that had weighed on me in the woods. Hayes was waiting for me, as if he'd known I would return in this state. He looked older than he had that morning, more worn down, and there was something in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before, a kind of resigned knowledge that made my stomach turn. I reported everything to Hayes, describing the figures, the voice, the impossible things I'd witnessed. But his face remained impassive throughout my account, as if he'd heard it all before. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, but never showing the shock or disbelief I expected. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the forest that loomed dark against the evening sky. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "You're lucky you got out," he said quietly. "Most don't." The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact acceptance, sent a chill through me. "You know what's out there," I said. It wasn't a question. Hayes nodded slowly, his weathered face creased with lines that seemed deeper in the fading light. "We've always known. My father knew, his father before him. This town's been dealing with this for generations. The disappearances aren't new, they're just more frequent now. Then why haven't you reported it? Why haven't you called for help? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Help from who? You think anyone would believe what you just told me? You think anyone would believe what I could tell you? He gestured toward the missing persons flyers on the wall. We report what we can, the facts that make sense. People went missing in the woods. That's all anyone wants to hear. But the figures in the forest were people once. People just like the ones on those flyers. Hayes's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The forest takes them, changes them, makes them into something else. Guardians, maybe, or collectors. I don't pretend to understand it. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. How many people know about this? Everyone who's lived here long enough. You don't survive in Fort Kent without learning the rules. Don't go into the woods alone. Don't go into the woods after dark. Don't go into the woods when they call to you. He looked directly at me, and I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of what was in the forest, but fear of what I might do with this knowledge. And you just accept it? What choice do we have? We tried fighting it, back in my grandfather's time. Lost half the town. The things in the forest, they're not evil exactly. They're just doing what they were made to do. Long as we respect their territory, they mostly leave us alone. Mostly? Hayes was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out a bottle from his desk drawer and poured himself a drink. He offered me one, and I took it, my hands still shaking from the encounter in the woods. Every so often, someone comes through who doesn't know the rules. Tourists, hikers, investigators. He looked at me pointedly. The forest calls to them, just like it called to you today. Most of them answer the call. Join the watchers in the trees. The whiskey burned, but it helped steady my nerves. The shoe I found belonged to a hiker from last month. State investigator, just like you. Thought he was smarter than the forest. Hayes finished his drink and set the glass down with a sharp click. They always leave something behind, the ones who get taken. A shoe, a piece of clothing, sometimes just hair or fingernails, like a calling card, or maybe a warning. There has to be something we can do. Some way to stop this. Hayes shook his head. You don't stop something that's been here longer than memory. You learn to live with it, or you join it. Those are the only choices. I spent that night in my motel room, but sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. The settling of the building, the wind in the trees outside, the distant call of night birds that might not have been birds at all. The whiskey helped, but not enough. I found myself standing at the window staring out at the forest that surrounded the town like a living wall. In the darkness between the trees, I could see lights moving. Pale, cold lights that drifted through the shadows like will-o'-the-wisps. Sometimes they came close to the edge of the woods, close enough that I could almost make out shapes, human shapes that moved with that same wrong, gliding motion I'd seen earlier. Around 3 in the morning, I heard scratching at my window, soft at first, then more insistent. When I worked up the courage to look, I saw a face pressed against the glass. One of the figures from the forest, its hollow eyes reflecting the light from my room. It mouthed something at me, words I couldn't hear through the glass but somehow understood. Join us. It's easier if you don't fight. I closed the curtains and sat in the darkness until dawn, my service weapon in my lap, knowing that it would be useless if they really wanted to get me. The next morning, I packed my bags and prepared to leave Fort Kent. There was nothing more I could do here. No case to solve, no criminals to catch, no justice to serve. Just an ancient evil that had learned to coexist with the people who fed it, and people who had learned that survival sometimes required terrible compromises. I left Fort Kent the next day, filing a report that mentioned unexplained disappearances and recommended that the area be designated as dangerous for civilian access. I suggested increased patrols and better warning signs, knowing that these measures would do nothing to address the real problem but might save a few lives. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only scratched the surface of something much darker and more complex than I could understand. The forest had let me go, but I knew it was a temporary reprieve. I'd seen too much, learned too much. Sooner or later it would call to me, just as it had called to all the others. In my rearview mirror, Fort Kent disappeared behind the trees, swallowed up by the forest that surrounded it. But I could still see them, pale shapes moving between the trunks, keeping pace with my car as I fled. And maybe, just maybe, I recognized one of them. A tall figure in the remains of a state investigator's jacket. its hollow eyes fixed on me with something that might have been recognition or might have been hunger. I drove faster, but I knew it was already too late. The forest had marked me, just as it had marked all the others, and someday, when I least expected it, I would hear its call, and like everyone else who had ventured too deep into its shadows, I would have to choose between fighting a battle I couldn't win, or joining the watchers who stand guard in the darkness between the trees. The case file on the Fort Kent disappearances remains open, but no other investigators have been assigned to it. The official recommendation is that the area is too dangerous for civilian access due to unstable terrain and frequent weather emergencies. The truth, of course, is something else entirely. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still and the darkness presses close, I can hear it calling, a whisper in the shadows, a promise of peace for those who stop fighting and accept what they're meant to become. So far, I've been strong enough to resist, but I know that strength won't last forever. The forest is patient. It has all the time in the world. The summer of 2004 in Pittsburgh was unusually hot and stifling. I remember the way the heat shimmered off the asphalt, how it clung to my skin like an unwelcome second layer. My name is Nico Bear, and back then I was just another face in the crowd of young professionals trying to make their mark in the Steel City. My days were a blur of client meetings and design mock-ups at the small graphic design firm where I worked. Nights were spent nursing beers at local dives, complaining about the heat, and dreaming of something more. Anything to break the monotony. It was on one of these sticky Friday evenings that Ivan burst into O'Malley's, our regular haunt, with a glint in his eye that I'd come to recognize as trouble. "Guys, I've got it," he announced, sliding into our booth. The perfect escape. Mark, ever the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. "Last time you said that, we ended up lost in Ohiopolis State Park for 6 hours. I chuckled, remembering that misadventure. Ivan had a knack for grand ideas that often fell short in execution, but his enthusiasm was infectious, and God knows we needed some excitement. No, this is different," Ivan insisted, leaning in conspiratorially. "My family's old cabin in Allegheny National Forest. It's been sitting empty for years. We could head up there for the weekend, do some fishing, grill some burgers. Complete disconnection from the world." The idea was tempting. A weekend away from the suffocating city, surrounded by nature. No cell phones, no deadlines, no responsibilities. "I don't know, man," Mark said, his forehead creasing with worry lines. "Isn't that place pretty remote? What if something goes wrong?" I watched as Ivan's face fell slightly. He and Mark had been friends since college, but they were polar opposites. Ivan was all impulse and adventure, while Mark approached life with the caution of a bomb disposal expert. "That's the beauty of it," Ivan countered. "We'll be on our own, like real outdoorsmen. Come on, when's the last time we did something spontaneous?" I found myself nodding along. "You know, it doesn't sound half bad. I could use a break from the grind." Mark still looked unconvinced, but I could see him wavering. "What about supplies? We can't just rush off into the wilderness unprepared." "We've got all day tomorrow to get ready," Ivan said, his excitement building. "I've got some old camping gear we can use. We'll stock up on food, bring plenty of beer. It'll be like those trips we used to take in college, remember?" As Ivan spoke, I felt a familiar stirring of anticipation. It had been too long since we'd done something like this. Life had a way of boxing you in, of making you forget the thrill of the unknown. "I'm in," I said, surprising myself with my decisiveness. Mark sighed, a sound of resigned acceptance. "Fine, but we're bringing a first aid kit, and extra batteries, and a map." Ivan whooped, clapping Mark on the back. "That's the spirit. Trust me, guys. This is going to be a weekend we'll never forget." As we clinked our beer bottles together, sealing our pact, I had no idea how prophetic Ivan's words would prove to be. No idea of the terror that awaited us in those dark, ancient woods. The next day was a flurry of activity. We met at Ivan's place, his living room a chaos of sleeping bags, coolers, and camping equipment in various states of disrepair. Mark, true to form, arrived with a backpack that seemed to contain half a hardware store. "Just in case," he said defensively, as Ivan and I exchanged amused glances. We spent the morning checking gear, making lists, and arguing good-naturedly about what constituted essential items. By early afternoon, Ivan's beat-up Jeep was packed to the brim, and we were ready to hit the road. As we pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the familiar streets of Pittsburgh, I felt a mix of excitement and a strange, nagging apprehension. I chalked it up to pre-trip jitters and pushed it aside, focusing instead on the adventure ahead. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent camping trip would become the crucible in which our friendships and our sanity would be tested. The horrors that awaited us in Allegheny National Forest would change us forever, leaving scars both seen and unseen. But as we drove north, windows down and music blaring, we were just three friends chasing a break from the ordinary, blissfully unaware that we were driving straight into the heart of a nightmare. The drive north was a blur of fading urban sprawl, giving way to rolling hills and increasingly dense forests. Yvonne's old Jeep Cherokee rattled along the highway, packed to the brim with our gear. The air grew cooler as we climbed in elevation, a welcome respite from Pittsburgh's oppressive heat. Mark sat in the back, nose buried in a detailed topographical map of Allegheny National Forest. "You sure you remember how to get there, Ivan?" he asked for what felt like the 100th time. Ivan rolled his eyes, hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "Yes, Mom. It's been a while, but some things you don't forget." I watched the tension build between them, a familiar dynamic. "Hey, how about some music?" I suggested, reaching for the radio dial. As we delved deeper into Pennsylvania's northern reaches, the landscape became wilder, more untamed. Towering pines replaced deciduous trees, their branches reaching out over the road like grasping fingers. The shadows they cast seemed to grow longer, darker. "Should be coming up on the turnoff soon," Ivan murmured, more to himself than to us. His eyes scanned the roadside, searching for familiar landmarks. Suddenly, he jerked the wheel, sending us bumping down a rutted dirt road. I would have missed entirely. "This is it," he announced triumphantly. The road, if you could call it that, was barely wide enough for the Jeep. Branches scraped against the sides of the vehicle as we inched our way deeper into the forest. The sun, already low in the sky, was almost entirely blocked out by the thick canopy above. "Jesus, Ivan," Mark muttered from the back seat. "When you said remote, you weren't kidding." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The forest pressed in around us, ancient and indifferent. For the first time, I wondered if we'd made a mistake in coming here. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. And there, nestled against the edge of the forest, stood Ivan's family cabin. Rustic was a generous description. The cabin was a simple, single-story structure of weathered logs. A sagging porch ran along the front, and a stone chimney climbed up one side. It looked like it had been standing there since before the Revolutionary War, stubbornly resisting the forest's attempts to reclaim it. "Home sweet home," Ivan declared, killing the engine. We piled out of the Jeep, stretching cramped muscles and breathing in the crisp mountain air. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. As we unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking at the tree line. But there was never anything there, just shadows and swaying branches. Inside, the cabin was musty and thick with dust. Cobwebs festooned every corner, and the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. But it was shelter, and after a bit of cleaning, it started to feel almost cozy. We got a fire going in the old pot-bellied stove, chasing away the chill and some of the gloom. As night fell, we sat around the rickety kitchen table, nursing beers and playing cards by lantern light. "See?" Ivan said, gesturing expansively. "What did I tell you? Perfect getaway." Mark nodded grudgingly.
"It's not bad. Quiet, at least."
I murmured agreement, but I couldn't fully relax. There was something about this place, something that set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity, the isolation, but deep down, a part of me knew it was more than that. As we turned in for the night, settling onto creaky cots with our sleeping bags, I lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. The wind in the trees sounded almost like whispers, and somewhere in the distance, something howled. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. But as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that coming here had been a terrible mistake. I jolted awake, heart pounding, unsure what had disturbed me. The cabin was pitch black, the fire having died down to embers. For a moment, I was completely disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings adding to my confusion. Then I heard it again, the sound that had woken me. A low scraping noise, like something being dragged across the outer wall of the cabin. "Guys," I whispered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "You hear that?" Ivan stirred on his cot, mumbling incoherently. Mark sat up, instantly alert. "What is it?" he asked, voice tense. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, near one of the windows. We all froze, straining our ears. "Probably just a branch," Ivan said, but he didn't sound convinced. Mark reached for his flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes and casting long shadows. Slowly we got up, moving towards the window. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, and I winced at each sound, irrationally afraid of alerting whatever was out there to our presence. We peered out into the night, but the flashlight's beam couldn't penetrate far into the inky blackness. The trees loomed, their branches swaying slightly in a breeze we couldn't feel. And then we saw them. 2 pinpricks of light, reflecting the flashlight beam, eyes watching us from the edge of the clearing. "Holy shit," Ivan breathed. The eyes blinked once, slowly, then vanished. We stood there frozen, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eventually, Mark broke the silence. "It's gone now. Probably just a deer or something." But we all knew it wasn't a deer. Deer don't drag themselves along cabin walls. Deer don't watch you with that kind of intelligence, that kind of hunger. None of us slept much after that. We huddled around the rekindled fire, talking in low voices about anything and everything except what we'd seen. As dawn broke, painting the forest in shades of gray and pale gold, we all pretended to believe it had been nothing more than a shared hallucination, born of unfamiliar surroundings and too many ghost stories. But I saw the way Ivan's hands shook as he made coffee, the tightness around Mark's eyes as he scanned the tree line. We were all on edge, jumping at every sound. "So, what's the plan for today?" I asked, desperate for some normalcy. Ivan latched onto the question like a lifeline. "I thought we could try our luck fishing. There's a lake about a mile east of here." Mark nodded enthusiastically. "Sounds good. Fresh air, sunshine, just what we need." We all pointedly ignored the fact that what we really needed was to get the hell out of these woods. But none of us wanted to be the first to suggest cutting our trip short. It would have meant admitting that we were scared, that the thing we'd seen was real. So instead, we gathered our fishing gear and set out, leaving the relative safety of the cabin behind. The forest was different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less alien. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. We tried to keep the conversation light as we hiked, joking and reminiscing about past trips. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a wariness that hadn't been there before. We all kept glancing over our shoulders, starting at sudden noises. The lake, when we reached it, was beautiful. Crystal clear water reflected the sky like a mirror, surrounded by towering pines. On any other day, it would have been idyllic, but now it just felt exposed. We set up on the shore, casting our lines into the still water. For a while, it almost felt normal. We caught a few small trout, congratulating each other and speculating about how we'd cook them. But as the day wore on, I noticed Mark growing increasingly agitated. He kept staring across the lake, towards the far shore where the trees grew right up to the water's edge. "You okay, man?" I asked, following his gaze but seeing nothing unusual. He startled, then tried to smile. "Yeah, just thought I saw something. Trick of the light, probably." But I knew he was lying, and as I looked more closely, I saw it too. A figure, standing just inside the tree line, too far away to make out any details, but unmistakably human-shaped, and it was watching us. "Guys," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. "I think we should head back." Ivan opened his mouth to protest, but then he saw it too. The color drained from his face. "Yeah," he said weakly. "Yeah, let's go." We packed up quickly, all pretense of enjoying ourselves abandoned. As we hurried back through the forest, the shadows seemed to deepen, the trees pressing in closer. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps following us. By the time we reached the cabin, we were all but running. We burst through the door, slamming it behind us and throwing the bolt. For a long moment, we all just stood there, panting and wide-eyed. Then Mark broke the silence. "What the hell is going on here, Ivan?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation and fear. Ivan's face was a mask of confusion and growing panic. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear I don't know what's happening." Mark paced the small confines of the cabin, agitation evident in every movement. "This isn't normal. That thing we saw last night, and now this figure by the lake? This isn't some animal, Ivan. What aren't you telling us?" I watched the exchange, my own fear and confusion mounting. Part of me wanted to believe there was a rational explanation for everything we'd experienced, but a larger part knew we had stumbled into something beyond our understanding. "Guys, calm down," I said, trying to be the voice of reason even as my own thoughts raced. "Let's think this through. What do we actually know?" Mark stopped pacing, turning to face me. "We know there's something out there. Something that's watching us, following us, and it's not animal, not entirely." Ivan slumped onto one of the cots, head in his hands. "I swear I didn't know about any of this. The cabin's been in my family for generations, but we haven't used it in years. If there were stories, legends, I never heard them." A heavy silence fell over us. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the forest in deep reds and purples. Soon it would be dark again. "We need to leave," Mark said finally. "First thing in the morning, we pack up and get out of here." Ivan and I nodded in agreement. None of us relished the idea of another night in the cabin, but the thought of trying to navigate the treacherous forest road in the dark was even worse. We set about securing the cabin as best we could, checking windows and barricading the door with what little furniture we had. Ivan found an old shotgun in a closet, but the ancient weapon provided little comfort. As night fell, we huddled around the stove, talking in low voices and jumping at every sound. Sleep was out of the question. We took turns keeping watch, peering out into the darkness for any sign of movement. It was during my watch, in the coldest, darkest hour before dawn, that I heard it, a low, mournful sound, somewhere between a howl and a moan. It echoed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. "Guys," I hissed, waking Ivan and Mark from their fitful dozing. "Listen." The sound came again, closer this time, and with it a rhythmic thumping, like heavy footsteps approaching the cabin. We huddled together, weapons at the ready. Ivan with the shotgun, Mark with his hunting knife, me with a heavy flashlight. The thumping grew louder, and then something slammed against the door with enough force to make the whole cabin shudder. "Oh God," Ivan whimpered. "Oh God, oh God." The pounding continued, interspersed with that terrible moaning howl. Wood splintered, and I knew the door wouldn't hold much longer. "The back door," Mark whispered urgently. "We have to make a run for it." It was insanity, fleeing into the dark forest with that thing right outside. But staying meant certain death. We grabbed our packs already prepared for a quick escape, and crept towards the rear of the cabin. The pounding at the front door reached a crescendo, and with a final mighty crash, it gave way. "Now," Mark yelled, throwing open the back door. We burst out into the night, running blindly into the forest. Behind us I heard a roar of frustration, and the sound of pursuit. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I could hear Ivan gasping for breath beside me, Mark's steady footfalls just ahead. And behind us, always behind us, the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs trembled, the adrenaline of fear pushing us beyond our limits. Finally, we broke through the trees into a small clearing, moonlight illuminating a decrepit structure, the old ranger station Ivan had mentioned. "Inside," Mark commanded, and we didn't need to be told twice. We threw ourselves through the door, slamming it shut behind us. For a moment we just stood there, gasping for air, listening intently for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees and the pounding of our own hearts. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of our situation set in. We were lost in the forest, miles from help, with some unknown horror hunting us. "What do we do now?" Ivan asked, his voice small and frightened. Mark, always the practical one, was already examining our surroundings. "We need to find a way to contact help. There has to be a radio or something here." I nodded, forcing myself to focus. "Okay, let's search the place. And Let's stick together. No one goes anywhere alone. As we began to explore the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever was out there, whatever had driven us from the cabin, wasn't going to give up easily. And as the night wore on, I wondered if any of us would make it out of these woods alive. The old ranger station was a time capsule, a relic from a bygone era. Dust-covered furniture and outdated equipment filled the small space, creating an eerie atmosphere of abandonment. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay and disuse. Mark immediately set about searching for anything we could use to call for help. Ivan slumped into a chair, his face pale and drawn. I took up position by the window, peering out into the darkness, every muscle tense as I waited for some sign of our pursuer. Found something. Mark's excited whisper cut through the tense silence. He held up an ancient-looking radio, its dials caked with grime. No idea if it still works, but it's our best shot. We gathered around as Mark fiddled with the dials, static hissing from the speakers. For long, agonizing minutes, there was nothing but white noise. Then, miraculously, a voice crackled through. "Ranger Station 4, come in. This is headquarters, over." We looked at each other, hope dawning on our faces. Mark grabbed the microphone. "Hello? Can anyone hear us? We need help." There was a pause. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. "This is Ranger McAllister. Who am I speaking with? What's your situation?" Mark quickly explained our predicament, trying to convey the urgency without sounding completely unhinged. There was a long silence after he finished. "Stay where you are," Ranger McAllister finally said, his voice grave. "I'm on my way. Do not under any circumstances leave that station. Over and out." The radio went silent, leaving us in a mixture of relief and renewed tension. Help was coming, but we still had to survive until it arrived. "What do you think he knows?" Ivan asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. He didn't seem surprised. Before anyone could answer, a sound from outside froze us in place. A low guttural growl, followed by the snap of breaking branches. "It found us," I whispered, backing away from the window. The growl came again, closer this time. Something heavy slammed against the outer wall of the station, making the whole structure shudder. "We need weapons," Mark said, his voice tight with controlled fear. We frantically searched the station, grabbing anything that could be used as a weapon. I found an old fire axe, its head rusted but still sharp. Mark armed himself with a heavy flashlight and a letter opener that looked more decorative than functional. Ivan, still pale and shaking, clutched a chair leg he'd broken off. The pounding continued, punctuated by that awful growling. Whatever was out there, it was trying to get in. "What do we do?" Ivan whispered, his knuckles white around his makeshift weapon. Mark's face was grim. "We hold out. Help is coming. We just need to survive until then." A window shattered, showering the floor with broken glass. A long, dark arm snaked through the opening, groping blindly. Without thinking, I swung the axe, aiming for the limb. There was a sickening thud as the blade connected, followed by a howl of pain. The arm withdrew, leaving behind a smear of dark, viscous fluid on the windowsill. "Jesus," Ivan breathed, looking like he might be sick. But we had no time to process what had just happened. The attack intensified, the creature throwing itself against the walls and doors with renewed fury. We took up defensive positions, backs to each other, weapons at the ready. The minutes stretched into hours, each moment an eternity of tension and fear. Just when I thought we couldn't hold out any longer, when the walls seemed ready to give way under the relentless assault, we heard it. The distant rumble of an engine, growing louder. The creature outside must have heard it too. With a final frustrated roar, it retreated into the forest. Moments later, headlights cut through the darkness. A truck pulled up, and a burly man in a ranger's uniform stepped out, shotgun in hand. "You boys all right?" Ranger McAllister called out. We stumbled out of the station, relief making our legs weak. The ranger's eyes widened as he took in our battered appearance and the damage to the station. "Let's get you out of here," he said grimly. "We can talk on the way." As we piled into Ranger McAllister's truck, the adrenaline that had kept us going began to wear off. The events of the night crashed over me in a wave of delayed shock and exhaustion. The Ranger drove swiftly but carefully along the narrow forest road, his eyes constantly scanning the trees around us. The shotgun lay across his lap, a silent reminder that we weren't out of danger yet. "So," McAllister said after a few minutes of tense silence, "want to tell me exactly what happened out there?" We took turns recounting our experience, from the first night at the cabin to our desperate flight to the ranger station. McAllister listened without comment, his expression growing more grave with each passing moment. When we finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. "I was afraid of this," he muttered, almost to himself. "You know what that thing is?" Mark asked, leaning forward from the back seat. McAllister was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "There are things in these woods," he said finally, "that don't show up in any guidebook. Things that most folks don't believe in, don't want to believe in." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "What kind of things?" The ranger's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Old things, hungry things. The kind of things that were here long before us and will be here long after we're gone." We all digested this in silence. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but after what we'd seen and experienced, I couldn't. Suddenly, McAllister slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. In the headlights, a massive dark shape loomed on the road ahead. "Oh God," Ivan whimpered from beside me. The shape moved, resolving itself into a vaguely humanoid form, but it was too tall, too thin to be human. Its limbs were impossibly long, ending in wickedly curved claws, and its face, where there should have been a face, there was only a smooth, blank expanse of skin. "Hold on," McAllister growled, throwing the truck into reverse. We shot backwards, the engine roaring. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature loping after us, moving with a terrible fluid grace. McAllister spun the wheel, the truck fishtailing as we careened down a side road. Branches whipped against the windows as we plunged deeper into the forest. "Where are we going?" Mark yelled over the engine's roar. "There's an old fire road up ahead," McAllister shouted back. "If we can make it there, we might have a chance." The truck bounced and jolted over the uneven ground. In the darkness beyond our headlights, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows flitting between the trees. "There's more than one," I realized with dawning horror. McAllister nodded grimly. "They hunt in packs." We burst out of the trees onto a wider dirt road. McAllister floored the accelerator, and we shot forward. For a moment, I dared to hope we might make it. Then something massive slammed into the side of the truck. We spun out of control, tires skidding on loose gravel. There was a sickening lurch as we tipped over, and then we were rolling, the world turning into a chaos of shattering glass and screeching metal. When the motion finally stopped, I found myself hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Disoriented and in pain, I looked around frantically for the others. Mark was already cutting himself free with his pocket knife. Ivan hung limply in his seat, a gash on his forehead bleeding freely. McAllister was nowhere to be seen. "We need to move," Mark said urgently, reaching over to help me with my seatbelt. "Can you walk?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. We managed to drag Ivan out of the wreck, supporting him between us. And then we were running again, stumbling through the dark forest with no idea where we were going. Behind us, I could hear the creatures crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with each passing second. We ran blindly through the night, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Ivan was barely conscious, a dead weight between Mark and me. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer. I could hear the creatures' heavy breathing, the snap of twigs under their feet. They were toying with us, I realized. They could have caught us at any time, but they were drawing out the chase, savoring our fear. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, when my legs were ready to give out and my lungs burned with each breath, we broke through the trees into a clearing. And there, like a beacon of hope, stood a small cabin. "There," Mark gasped. "Come on." We stumbled towards the structure, praying it wasn't locked. Behind us, I heard a triumphant howl. They knew we were cornered. The door thankfully swung open at Mark's touch, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. Mark dragged a heavy table in front of the door while I lowered Ivan onto a dusty couch. "Where are we?" I asked, looking around the small, rustic interior. Mark shook his head. "No idea, but it's shelter, at least for now." A thud against the outer wall made us both jump. They were here, We huddled in the center of the room, watching as the walls shook under the creature's assault. The windows rattled in their frames, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they gave way. "What do we do now?" I whispered, gripping my axe so tightly my knuckles were white. Mark's face was grim in the dim light. "We fight. It's all we can do." A window shattered, and a long clawed arm reached through. Mark swung his flashlight, connecting with a satisfying crunch. The arm withdrew, but I knew it was only temporary. The attack intensified. The cabin groaned and creaked under the onslaught. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and I wondered how much longer the structure would hold. And then, cutting through the chaos, we heard it. The distinctive thump-thump-thump of helicopter blades. "Help!" I breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "Help is coming." The creatures must have heard it too. Their attacks became more frenzied, more desperate. They knew their time was running out. A spotlight swept over the clearing, momentarily blinding us. And then, incredibly, I heard human voices shouting. The sharp retort of gunfire. The creatures retreated, melting back into the forest with inhuman speed. One moment they were there, throwing themselves against the cabin walls, and the next they were gone, leaving behind only scratch marks and a lingering sense of terror. We stumbled out of the cabin, blinking in the harsh light of the helicopter's spotlight. A team of heavily armed men in tactical gear surrounded us, their weapons trained on the tree line. "Are you all right?" One of them shouted over the noise of the helicopter. I nodded numbly, still not quite believing we had survived. As they loaded us into the helicopter, I caught a glimpse of Ranger McAllister. He was battered and bloodied, but alive. He gave me a grim nod before turning back to survey the dark forest. As we lifted off, leaving the nightmare behind, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering dread. We had escaped, but the memory of what we had experienced would stay with us forever. The days and weeks following our rescue passed in a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. The official story was that we had encountered an aggressive bear, maybe a whole pack of them, but we knew the truth, and so did the men who had rescued us. Ivan was hospitalized for a week with a severe concussion and various cuts and bruises. Mark threw himself into research, obsessively combing through folklore and cryptozoology texts for any mention of creatures like the ones we had encountered. And me? I tried to go back to my normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. We were sworn to secrecy about what had really happened in Allegheny National Forest. The government agents who debriefed us made it clear that speaking out would have serious consequences. But even if we could have talked about it, who would have believed us? Months passed. Ivan moved away, unable to handle the memories and the nightmares. Mark's obsession grew, leading him down increasingly bizarre conspiracy theory rabbit holes. We drifted apart, each of us dealing with the trauma in our own way. But the memories never faded. Every rustle in the bushes, every unexplained sound in the night, brought it all rushing back. The terror, the helplessness, the realization that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than we had ever imagined. I find myself unable to enjoy the outdoors like I used to. Camping trips and hikes hold no appeal now. Instead, I stay in the city, surrounded by the comforting buzz of civilization. But even here, in the heart of Pittsburgh, I sometimes catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A too-tall figure lurking in an alley. A flash of inhuman movement on a rooftop. And I wonder, did we really escape that night, or did we just bring something back with us? Something ancient and hungry that has now found new hunting grounds. I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I do know this. There are things out there in the dark, things that most people will never see or understand. And once you've seen them, once you know they exist, you can never go back to the person you were before. So if you find yourself in the woods, if you hear something moving in the shadows, or see eyes gleaming in the darkness, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because the alternative, well, let's just say there are fates worse than death waiting in the wild places of the world. And to those who might be tempted to seek out these creatures, to prove their existence to the world, I have only this to say: be careful what you wish for. Some truths are better left undiscovered, some mysteries better left unsolved, because once you've stared into the face of the unknown, you'll find that it's been staring back at you all along. This is my story, my warning. Believe it or don't, that's up to you. But the next time you're in the woods and you hear something that doesn't quite fit, something that sends a chill down your spine, remember that there are things out there, ancient and hungry things, and they're always watching, always waiting for their next meal. Sleep well, and pleasant dreams. Just don't forget to check under your bed before you turn out the lights. You never know what might be hiding in the shadows.